Welcome everyone to the VEF Virtual Series. For those who are joining for the first time, the VEF Virtual Series, guided by the theme Accelerating Energy Transition, is a sequence of online consultations that explore the pathways that stimulate demand and promote economic recovery in 3 end-use sectors. So this is the 5th session of our industry track, and it's covering industry decarbonization and hard-to-abate sectors. Now, before we begin, I would like to draw your attention to our networking station. It should be on the left of your screen under the series button that you just clicked. This will be open from 3:30 to 3:45, and it is an excellent opportunity for you to interact with the pool of participants in today's session, so don't miss out. And then to break the ice, we would like to start with a quick interactive poll. So on the right side of your screen, there is a tab called Slido. It's a chat, polls, people, and then Slido. If you click on it, you will see a question and a box to type an answer. So please make sure to send in your response within the next hour, and we will regroup after the breakout rooms discussions to take a look at the results. So the question is, in 1 to 2 words, what is the priority action needed to create the market for low carbon products like iron, steel, and cement? Again, if I was too fast or you didn't listen very well, just click on the Slido tab to the right and you will see the question and you can type in your answer. Now, to begin with today's program, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Rana Ghanem. She's the Chief of the Energy Systems and Infrastructures Divisions here at UNIDO. So I'm just going to let her in. Hi, Rana.
Great. Hi, hello and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of UNIDO in this very important session where we're going to do all the hard talk about how to drive the deep decarbonization in energy intensive sectors. These sectors today account for 15 to 20% of the global GHG emissions and around 50% of the energy consumption in industry. They're quite a big opportunity, and also at the same time that if we miss, we're just simply not going to be reaching our climate goals. Iron and steel, cement and concrete are all commodities that are essential in industrial and economic development. They provide us the key materials for buildings and infrastructures. As countries and cities grow, we are seeing a growing demand for these commodities. However, the market is really highly competitive and with very low margins for profit. And implementing clean energy projects often competes with the other capital investment priorities that the companies have. At the moment, there is no existing market that is ready to pay a premium for these low carbon steel or cement. However, if we continue with this business as usual, the heavy industry will account for the world's entire budget in 2050. And as I said earlier, the climate goals will be out of reach. With important events that are coming up in 2021, like the high-level dialogue on energy in September or the COP26 in November, we really must take action to decarbonize these sectors. And in today's discussions, we will explore what is the status quo of the technologies that are available to deliver the high heat that is needed by these industries, and how do we make information more available to industries and governments in making this transition. What are different countries doing to actually support the decarbonizations of these industries, and how can we foster more learnings among countries that are proceeding with that? How can the global community collectively work on creating markets and demand for low carbon steel and cement? And is there a need for a universal benchmark and for market pull mechanisms like procurement commitments to actually drive the market? These are all some of the discussion points that will be captured by our speakers in the breakout rooms later. But for now, and to kick us off with the discussion, we have invited Rebecca Dell, who is the Director of Industry at the Climate Works Foundation, and who has recently published a report as well that looks into how do we create or how to create markets for these products within the US. We're very happy that Rebecca is here and can share the insights from her reports directly with us. Welcome, Rebecca, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Is everybody hearing me clearly? I hope. Great. So yes, I prepared a couple of slides. So I see those are coming up. Thank you very much, Anna Lucia, and thank you for the very kind introduction, Rana. As she said, I lead the industry program for the Climate Works Foundation in the United States, and I'm very pleased to be here to talk with you guys and to frame up this very important conversation. So can we go on to the next slide? I'm assuming that most of the people on in an online session like this one don't need a lot of explanation as to why we're having this conversation, but it's always useful to remind ourselves, why is this such an important issue? Well, so heavy industry, which is by which we mean usually the energy intensive industries or the primary material, primary commodity industries like metal, cement, and chemicals. Just those three industries are responsible for about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The metal industry, we're mostly talking about steel. The chemicals industry, we're mostly talking about plastics and fertilizers. So steel, cement, plastics, fertilizers, you put that together and you've got about a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions. We cannot reach our climate goals, we cannot achieve a Paris compliant future without dramatically reducing the emissions in these sectors. And I'm assuming also that the people, that all of you are reasonably familiar with what are the technology pathways, the technical pathways that we can use to reduce emissions in these industries. They vary a lot based on the particular industry and also your particular national circumstances. But in all cases, we're talking about some combination of switching to a zero carbon electricity source, like electricity, hydrogen, or ammonia, using carbon capture and storage, significantly increasing either energy efficiency or material efficiency. And those are kind of our big buckets for how we will reduce these emissions in a technical sense. The problem, we know that all of these approaches are going to be important. We don't know exactly which are the pathways or which combinations of these approaches are going to ultimately be the most important. And so the question in my mind is less about what exactly are the technologies and more about, in the context of that uncertainty, what are the things that we can do now to get ourselves on a road to net zero? What do we need to do in the next 2, 3, 5 years that will allow us to, by mid-century, get the emissions from these industries to near zero? So I was extremely pleased by the icebreaker poll topic because I think the most important thing we can do, and if you'll move to the next slide, is to create markets for low carbon commodities. So all of these most emissions intensive industries have the same basic characteristic, which is that they're all primary commodities, which is to say they produce basic materials that then feed into often long and complicated supply networks before they're eventually transformed into finished goods. And we need to create markets for finished goods that are made out of low GHG commodities, because this is the underlying logic in all cases is the same. We need to make sure that any additional cost of low GHG production is passed through to the final consumers. Particularly for new technologies, when we're first deploying things, those additional costs can be substantial from the perspective of the commodity industry. But because commodity materials are a small portion of the cost of finished goods, whether that finished good is a car or a building or a road or an aqueduct or an electricity transmission line. Because the materials are a small portion of the cost of the finished goods, using low GHG commodities is very affordable from the perspective of the purchaser of the finished good. So we need to create markets that pull these commodities through. We have a whole bunch of ways to do that. The first is buy clean or public procurement. This is a really important strategy because about a fifth of steel and about a half of cement goes into civil engineering works, which is to say infrastructure paid for with tax dollars. And if we design these public procurement policies well, they can incentivize both current best practices like high efficiency production and also innovation, new and even better practices. Another approach is clean product standards. So these are standards that apply to both public and private purchasing. And these are particularly important for advancing material efficiency. So increasing the, reducing the total demand or the increase in demand for these commodities by using the materials more efficiently. And this is particularly critical for building codes. And then there are purely private approaches where we have multiple structures available, things like voluntary standards. An example of that people might be familiar with is the responsible steel standard, advanced market commitments, buyers clubs, and all of these things are things that we used in the electricity sector to pull clean electricity into the market with a great deal of success. And we need to repeat that success with these commodities. Next slide, please. So creating markets is our foundation. We also need to support innovation because, as we all know, we have some good ideas about how to decarbonize these industries, but nobody knows exactly how we're going to make it work. And both public and private investment in innovation in heavy industry is very low compared with other sectors. So we need to increase and realign these expenditures. Many currently are really only focused on energy efficiency, not on an overall environmental performance, including local pollution and climate, or other co-benefits like worker safety. We also need to be integrating manufacturing, construction, and waste processing, which are often treated as three different things in our innovation thinking. We also need to demonstrate at scale. As probably you know, many of the technologies that we think are going to be very, very important in decarbonizing these industries have been languishing in laboratories or as part of small pilots for decades. This includes hydrogen reduction for steel, inert anodes for aluminum production, and many other things, where these are technologies that have been that have been under discussion by metallurgists and by other types of specialists since the 1960s or earlier, but are only just now, or even not yet, getting serious consideration. So we need to be pulling them into the market, and then we need to be supporting their demonstration at scale. And so we can distribute the technology risk of these really important new process technologies. A potential model for this is the important projects of common European interest model that the European Union uses specifically for demonstrating strategic technologies. And they have a combination of both regulations and funding that are purpose-built to demonstrate at scale critical new technologies, and is a model that's potentially worth spreading. So next slide, please. In addition to innovation, we're also going to need to support deployment at scale. Again, like we did in the power sector with with approaches, regulatory and financial approaches like feed-in tariffs or renewable portfolio standards. As more decarbonization options become available, we need to be supporting their deployment. And we have a very wide range of tools that we can use for this. that can be selected based on complementarity with other policies, national circumstances, the particular nature of the industry or the technology that you're targeting. But these include things like credit supports, tax credits, subsidies, including carbon contracts for differences, which I think is a very important model, and also direct contracting and investment from public bodies, from governments. Providing enabling infrastructure is going to be also critical and is a particularly important role for public sector actors. The enabling infrastructure that we're going to need at a minimum is going to include electricity systems that are designed to provide adequate power for these extremely energy intensive industries. We're not kidding when we call them energy intensive. A typical integrated steel mill, if fully electrified, would have an average load of probably 3 or 4 gigawatts, which is to say 3 or 4 nuclear power stations to run one steel mill. If we're going to be using large quantities of hydrogen as our energy carrier, we're going to need storage and transportation and production infrastructure for that. Similarly for carbon capture and storage and utilization. So we're going to have to be both supporting the decarbonization options themselves and the enabling infrastructure. Next slide, please. And then finally, we need to be protecting and investing in people. And I cannot emphasize how important this is. None of the other approaches will work if we don't have the right people to implement them, and none of them will be sustainable if large numbers of people throughout society are not seeing clear benefits from this agenda. And so if we're not protecting people and investing in people, then we're not going to get where we want to go. So this includes training practitioners throughout the value chain. This is industrial workers. This is also people who are critical users and decision makers of commodities, people like architects and structural engineers, and people who work in the building trades, people who are in real estate development. We need to be training all of them for how to do their jobs in a low carbon way. We need to target underserved communities for investment, whether that's investment in new, exciting new technologies and deployment, or investment in environmental remediation of the unfortunately sometimes toxic legacy of 20th century industry. Those are important economic investments, and we need to be targeting them to the communities that need them most. We need to be emphasizing quality job creation that protects workers' rights and safety and provides fair wages, and wages that are wages and benefits that are comparable to what workers are receiving in traditional fossil fuel-based industries. And there are going to be circumstances where workforce transitions are going to be needed, and those need to be properly funded. Along with this, we need to be investing in the informational infrastructure, so the expertise, the databases, that can support all of the other approaches, and in proper enforcement of the rules. By doing these things, as I said, we're making sure that people, that large numbers of individual people throughout society, people who are not the kind of people who show up for webinars on heavy industry, can see in their own lives clear benefits at every stage from this agenda. So last slide, please. So the message that I would like to leave you with is that a climate safe heavy industry, it's possible, it's affordable, and what it requires is the right investments and approaches. But we have a lot of information about what that can do, about how we can do that and how we can get started on that right now. There's no need for us to wait. And I really look forward to discussing these very important issues with all of you over the course of the next hour and a half. As Rana mentioned, if you're interested in learning more about this agenda, specifically in the US context, please visit the ClimateWorks website and you can download a recent report that we published.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Lots of really amazing thoughts that you've put forward. And I particularly love how you've ended it, because my frustration is always when you try to talk about iron and steel and cement to people, it's always pictures of the large furnaces, and I love the fact that you actually brought it back to people, so thanks a lot for that. And now it's actually time for us to head back into the discussion groups. So today we have 3 discussion groups: global perspectives, country voices, and enablers for progress, where we have a really great selection of experts that will share with us their thoughts. In the global perspectives, the discussion is moderated by Gökçe Mette from Sweden, and she's leading in the leadership group of the Climate Summit. She's leading that work, and there you have experts from IRENA, IEA, IDDRI, the Clean Energy Coalition, and many others. We're actually thankful because some of them even are getting up from New Zealand, where it's 2 in the morning or so, to just join this discussion, so thank you. In Country Voices, the discussion is moderated by Jennifer Leike, and we have representatives from countries like India. So we have Mr. Bakre from the Bureau for Energy Efficiency, Simeon Agada from the UK, but also we have representatives from Austria, Canada, and South Africa. If you're interested in the Enablers for Progress, then join that discussion, which is moderated by Morgan Basilian from Payne Institute. And we have representatives from the Mission Possible platform, which has done quite a lot of leading work in this area, representatives from industry, Rocky Mountain Institute, and others. So just click on your left side, there is the series, and there you can actually choose which of the breakout rooms you would like to join. And we rejoin here the plenary, so in 1 hour time, to actually hear the conclusions from our moderators on the main takeaways from the discussion. So enjoy the discussion, choose which group you want to listen to, and we'll see you again here in an hour.
So great, welcome everybody. So we have everybody with us, although this is missing. We will be joined by one more speaker shortly, but I could use this time to introduce myself. Rana mentioned, of course, the leadership group for the industrial transition, but briefly lead it in short is an initiative hosted by SEI. Its secretariat is hosted by Stockholm Environment Institute, in short SEI, and it was launched by the government of Sweden and India at the United Climate Action Summit in 2019. And since then it has been providing a platform for private-public partnership, knowledge sharing, and partnership building on industry transition. So we are still waiting for one more speaker, but I thought to not lose time, I would like to start our session, and Chris will join us hopefully in due time. I have seen he was in the main session.
I'm here.
And here he is.
I didn't realize I had to hit the share audio button.
You thought you'd be automatically
yeah.
I know. So welcome, Chris, too. Well, what I'll do is I'll just go through where each speaker is coming from, joining us from, but we will have the biographies below. So we are joined by Peter Levy from International Energy Agency, IEA in short. We have Emanuele Bianco from IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency. We are joined by Christian Diendorfer from Austrian Institute of Technology. We have Gamze Ünlü from IASA, and we are also joined by Chris. I'll really not do justice to your last name, so I'll leave it there. And we're joined by Chris, who is representing Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, and Leon Stille from New Energy Coalition. So at this session, we will be addressing two key questions around the technologies that present the greatest potential for industry decarbonization. And we will supplement this argument, this discussion on what policy levels and actions are available to support decarbonization of energy-intensive industries, but also to increase the ambition. Now, the IAA has been leading the development of a series of roadmaps for some of the most important technologies. So I'd like to open the panel with Peter and invite him to provide a brief overview of the main technologies and their characteristics to kick us off on this topic.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All good. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, so I want to keep this very brief, but everything I'm about to say would, as is easily referred to in our Energy Technology Perspectives latest edition, the 2020 edition. And essentially, I think we can break down the kind of industry clusters of mitigation options into three very broad categories to just simplify things. We've got measures where we can incrementally improve the performance of conventional technologies that we have with us today, whether it's blast furnaces or steam crackers or cement kilns. And here we can see that these measures are very important, but we can also see that the producers in this area are relatively well exposed to energy costs and are incentivized to bring down costs. We've then got technologies that enhance material efficiency, and there's a whole load of technologies there. And then we've got a third category, which I think is what we're focusing on perhaps today, is innovative technologies that really dramatically reduce the carbon intensity of production of materials. And I think within that third category, I would just draw out three more subcategories. I think there's technologies that we see broadly that are utilizing hydrogen as an intermediate energy carrier, as a reduction agent, or as a feedstock. And we've got technologies that manage the carbon in processes with carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies. And then we've got a third category, which isn't often actually distinguished, but is becoming, I think, more important with the projects that we see happening around the world and being invested in, is a category of direct electrification technologies. And here I'm not talking about technologies that can already be directly electrified in a commercial context today, like an electric arc furnace or an aluminium smelter. I'm talking about technologies like iron ore electrolysis, or like electrifying steam crackers, or electrifying cement kilns. And I think these three clusters, I mean, they're very broad, and of course we're talking about hundreds of technologies and projects in each of these subsectors. But maybe I hope maybe that those kind of initial clusters and provide a good framing for our discussion, and we can maybe go into more of the details of the upsides and downsides to each of these.
Excellent. So, Emanuele, I know at the Knowledge Policy and Finance Center division of IRENA that you are affiliated with, that you have also developed some studies on industry and green hydrogen. I'd like to now turn a little bit onto the policies and enabling policies side of the discussion. And I'd like to ask you some of your findings that are relevant on how country international decarbonization strategies interact with industrial strategies. Can you tell us a bit about your findings on that?
Yes, of course. So thank you for the question, and welcome everybody. Just for who doesn't know, yes, in IRENA we started last year a series of studies on green hydrogen policymaking. Of course, hydrogen became the second most said word in the energy sector after COVID in 2020. So it was important for us to understand how to separate hydrogen from hype, and what kind of actions policymakers could actually do in order to progress in this. And one important element in our findings was that strategies, policies so far have been a little, suffered a little, just being its versatility. You can use hydrogen in basically every sector. You can imagine using it even for heating a building. But not every use is the best use of hydrogen. If we really want 100% decarbonized world in the future, we need to understand that this has an important potential for a subset of uses, the ones that we are talking today. So once a country that it recognizes that not every technology is available for every sector, and those technologies that are so flexible must be used where it's actually needed. And actually, I believe that industry, the industrial sector, the industrial players have the important role to start to catch this technology now and not to wait until 2050. Otherwise, it's possible that there will be way more concurrent for these technologies in the transport sector, or even as proposed by some proponents in non-hard to decarbonize. Other thing mentioned by Peter, strategies that goes by increment, useful in certain sectors, like in the building sectors where you can have incremental changes, but in some sectors may lock in solutions for a long period of time. So it's important to note that we are not going to accept a non-fully decarbonized industrial sector by 2050 and they cannot invest in solutions that are only half cut.
That is a good point. Thank you, Emanuele. So we talked about not every hydrogen. Hydrogen is not sort of a solution for each, for every answer that we have in industry transition. There's a good point, so we talked also about. You mentioned that it's a good use for industry transitions, for the industrial sectors, and I want to actually turn now to Christian, and I'd like to ask you. So when we think about hydrogen in the hard-to-abate sectors, where do you think the hard-to-abate sector actually will be located in the future? Do you think, and what are the elements for that will be kind of deciding factors for that?
So looking a little bit back in history to the Middle Ages and so on, kilns and furnaces for the steel industry were mainly located in the close to forests because they used forest and charcoal as their fuel, and it was easier to bring the iron ore to the kiln in the forest than the wood or charcoal to the kiln where the iron ore is. And I personally believe that in the future we have to rethink this approach and discuss where we can locate our hard-to-abate industry. So maybe it has to move to locations where CCUS is possible, maybe to locations where we have enough renewable energy to provide a lot of hydrogen, which is might be used in the steel industry. And so maybe thinking about this and looking at it from a global perspective, I believe that we should really think about where to produce what. And I think this was also very well in the direction of what Emanuele already said. We have to look or be sure that we use the energy sources efficiently, but we also have to make sure that we have in terms of a spatial distribution of our industry, to also have an efficient point on that.
That's a great point. So there are many elements to take into account. We're talking about the availability of renewables, feasibility of CCS. So I'd like to turn now to Gamze, who has been extending their energy systems modeling to energy-intensive sectors. So I'd like to ask you, Gamze, about your findings on the most promising technology options from from a sectorial perspective?
Yes, so in ESA, we have been extending our integrated assessment model, which has an energy systems model in its core, by adding the detailed production representation of these 4 energy-intensive sectors, such as cement, steel, aluminum, and petrochemicals. And I have been mostly focusing on aluminum and petrochemical side. And during this work, we had the chance to explore a wide range of literature and reports to determine and see what are the technology potentials specifically in these sectors. So this is a technological perspective. And starting with the aluminum sector, probably as you all know, it is quite electricity intensive and contributes around 4% of the global electricity consumption. And this electricity either comes from grid or from the captive power plants. And here, actually, the major issue is there are a lot of young captive coal power plants, which are mostly located in China, where most of the aluminum production comes from. So from technological perspectives, I see 2 options stand out in the aluminum sector. One is actually cost competitive renewable power, electricity, which will then need to be supported by energy storage to ensure 24/7 operation. And there are already examples of hydropowered aluminum, for example, in Europe and in North America. But here the main question would be how to replace the existing fossil captive plants, ensuring cost effectiveness. Because considering the producers of these materials have very low profit margins, it would be a really capital intensive process, which is actually also a policy side of the discussion. And the second option that really stands out in the aluminum sector, specifically also in the other metal sectors, is recycling, which only requires 5% of the energy needed for the primary production. Of course, scrap availability can be a limitation here, but even an increase from today's 33% levels to 50 to 60 recycling rates in 2050 provides really significant emission reduction. So these are the key potential, I would say, from the aluminum sector, apart from other technological developments that address smaller share of process emissions, such as the development of inert anodes instead of carbon anodes. And then very briefly from the chemical sector perspective, here the energy intensive part is the production of primary chemicals, such as the high value chemicals, which are the building blocks of plastic. And most of the energy needs come from the feedstocks, actually. And in our model, we first integrated the high value chemical production chain. And here we observed the production related CO2 emissions are actually a small fraction, but emissions are mostly released at the end of the life cycle, especially if they are incinerated. They emit 3 to 4 times more than they emit during the production process. So the feedstock replacement comes forward here as an option, which we also chose to include in our model. Production from ethylene, production of ethylene from bioethylene, for example, which has several commercial applications, 2 of the biggest in Brazil and in India. And finally, secondly, I would say preventing incineration of these products, especially plastics, with advanced recycling technologies such as feedstock recycling and also enhanced collection and sorting would stand out as important technology options briefly in these 2 sectors.
Very insightful and great to hear about your research and findings. So I hear from that you mentioned a lot about circular economy. So it's really indeed value chain and supply chain aspect of the discussion. So now I'm turning to Chris, and I'd like to ask your opinion on how the supply chains of today may change in the face of net zero.
Sure. Okay. Can everyone hear me properly? First of all, I'd like to apologize for the horror film lighting because it's 5:30 here in Vancouver, so everything looks a little bit funny right now. I'd like to build on some comments by Rebecca, Peter, and Christian here. I think the physical pathways to decarbonizing industry are slowly becoming clear, and there are multiple options in several different sectors at this point in time. And a lot of this stuff's been sitting in laboratories, as people have said, and we kind of have to bring it forward. But the first thing we need to do is we need to engage on some fairly aggressive market reforms to allow demand response, both for physical materials, electricity, what have you, to allow material efficiency to happen. So we need reform of the architectural practices, civil engineering practices, construction practices, what have you. All of this to kind of start looking at materials and all the stuff of our civilization in a more circular way. And these are very practical things like education, building codes, making sure stuff's marked so we know what to do with it afterwards. Make sure we don't throw all our iron in with our copper when it goes into a smelter and then you can't use it for thin sheet products, that kind of thing. So a lot of this is practical, institutional, organizational stuff that it's not science fiction jumps forward into the future. We also need to de-risk transformation and production. So as several speakers have already said, we have an idea where a lot of these sectors can jump forward to in terms of near zero and zero emissions. But even for really big global firms, these are really, really insignificant investments. And if they go wrong, it can sink the firm. So we need means to de-risk, collectivize the risk, share it amongst all the participants, what have you, build by. A lot of this is going to be about, first of all, building lead and niche markets. So if firms can make very low GHG iron, steel, cement, chemicals, what have you, they need to know that they can sell it into a market, even if it costs 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%, or even double, at least for the first, 1 million tons, 10 million tons, 100 million tons, so that we can get up to speed in terms of these new technologies. Now, within the developed world, finance is not that expensive these days, and it isn't likely to be for the next 5 to 10 years. We're in a very abundant capital environment, but due to risk in developing countries, the weighted average cost of capital is often 2 to 3 times what it is in Europe and North America, Japan, or China. And we need mechanisms to adjust for that. So if we want this to be a global effort, and it needs to be a global effort, we need to target that directly and find ways to route cheaper capital through to sites in the developing world that allow us to make this a global effort. We need to think about sunsetting. So, there are a lot of blast furnaces out there. There are a lot of old cement plants, what have you. As stuff comes to, as it becomes possible to replace it with near zero emissions equipment, we need to start thinking about once something is paid off its capital, and if it's high emitting, it needs to be shut down, replaced with something else. And that has a lot of political economy aspects attached to that, and we need to build institutions to handle that. Coming back to the supply chains, Christian already meant this. There are a lot of possibilities with these new technologies. So I'm involved with a project right now where we're trying to, there's a mothballed DRI plant in South Africa that's in an amazing solar location. And it's quite feasible to think of setting up a solar field, putting electrolyzers, putting the necessary daily storage, what have you, and converting it to a hydrogen DRI plant for domestic production, but much more importantly for export of green iron to Europe, to North America, Japan, or China. And what that would allow you is just to skip the whole blast furnace route completely. What you do is activate a green iron to electric arc furnace route in the developed world. And this isn't something we're going to be doing. It's not immediate, but we need to start working on these revised supply chains. And you could do this with iron. You can do this with clinker. You make your clinker where there's CCS, then move the clinker to cement and concrete plants instead of doing it as an integrated facility. You can do it with all the sort of the chemical precursors, so hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, ethylene, what have you. So I'll stop there and let you take it away.
super interesting, and it connects us again with the topic that where do you put the plants? Where will the heart of it sectors be located? I'm quite glad we already started also talking about the different parts of the globe and different technologies and multiple solutions. So I'm now looking at Leon, and I'll be asking you whether, and I know you're currently working on several CCS projects and you've been involved, led the first hydrogen valley in the north of Netherlands. So I'm curious to find out, does CCS and hydrogen compete as a technological solution, and where is CCUS or hydrogen as a winner when we look at different sectors and geographies?
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you for having me here. I think to answer that question, the CCS and hydrogen are basically filling the same niche. So filling the same reason why you would put it on this kind of hard to abate sectors. So CCS was initially thought out to allow coal-fired power generation to be clean, so to say. But then that didn't really work out because the developments in the solar energy and the wind energy were so quick that they sort of catch up with that. But then if you continue on different sectors like steel and cement that all the speakers have already mentioned, then you can also put that on legacy industries as a system to allow your industry to continue to function somewhat similar to how it is now. The same is actually for hydrogen. So I think Christian mentioned the supply chains as well. That if I take an example from the Netherlands, for the country that I don't live in at the moment, but where I'm from, is that we put these big steel plants like Tata Steel, and also cement plants and other industries, we put them in the Netherlands because we had an abundance of natural gas available to make them work. So once you have them there, you have to do something with them if you find out later that it is not such a good idea to keep on burning natural gas. So then people are trying to find out what is the best solution to do so. And I would like to comment a little bit on the fact that I don't think this will happen from the industry themselves. So sometimes I feel that people are saying, okay, if we have enough innovation, if we have enough technological development, then the industry will also catch up. I don't think that is going to be the case. So we have to make some kind of level playing field based on a carbon tax or a carbon price, so that somebody who is more polluting will be punished and somebody who is going green will be rewarded. I think that's probably the only reason, and then it doesn't even matter what technology you're using. It can be hydrogen, it can be CCS. If there's room for it, if there's no public opposition for it, if it is allowed in the system, I think that is the main reason we should do that. In that context, the European Union idea to sort of set up a virtual boundary around the European Union to make sure that commodities or products that come in that have been produced in a polluting way, you actually put a tax on that to make sure that it is not in competition with whatever we're producing in the European Union that might be better. So I think in that sense, it's very interesting. And all these different technologies, except maybe CCUS, have not been really demonstrated on scale. Only CCS, there are some plants, but for hydrogen, it's all tiny, a little bit tiny technologies. So we really have to continue with that to see if that works out.
Thank you, Leon. Now, I would like to bring us back to the discussion around we've already touched upon the topic of developing countries. And so what I want to ask is technology transfer from developed to developing countries happening? And what do we need for it to pick up? If any of you could jump in, I'm going to do it voluntarily, and I have a follow-up question, but would anybody like to come in on that, on technology transfer point? Perhaps Chris,
yeah, well,
and then Leon, maybe let's start with you.
Maybe technology transfer is something that is hard to do, of course, especially if you're talking about these new type of technologies that have not been applied on scale, even in the more developing settings. But I think we should be careful. Like developing countries can leapfrog very well, and so if you're going to put something new, but then again you have the like Chris mentioned, you have the capital barrier, but it is possible to put something completely new in a developing country that can be very advantageous to start up this technology. But you still have to adjust it to the local context, to the local supply chain, to the way it is. I think that's very important, because a lot of projects I've been involved in have sort of failed because they failed to take into account the unique settings of the countries that we were talking about in, for example, East Africa. But maybe Chris can continue.
No, this is a fascinating area, because there's a bunch of there's probably about 10 different key technologies and sub-technologies they're going to be necessary to make this all work out, from concentrated CCS to post-combustion CCS to electrolyzers and what have you. For everything to happen at the speed we need it to happen, it needs to be available globally. But you also need to reward the innovators, because they're not going to take the risks to pump R&D and commercialization. So it needs to be a combined thing where we need to figure out how to reward the innovators, pay them, make sure they get rewarded for that, for the risks they're taking for that technology, and yet get the IP out into the global setting. Like, perhaps the Midrex technology is core to the whole DRI process, but they're in the business of licensing their technology. They don't build the thing, right? So and they help adapt it globally. So it's something along those lines that we need to go down the route to, because we can't start creating monopolies of these key technologies and constraining their deployment in the market. We need this stuff to get out there.
And Peter,
also, maybe if I can add,
yes, please.
Oh, sorry, if I quickly add,
Yeah,
to that,
sure.
Is that indeed what I also find sometimes, especially with hydrogen, is that it very quickly goes from, okay, it is difficult to produce here in Europe, perhaps, so let's get it somewhere else. We figure out all kinds of scenarios where we go to places where there's apparently lots of sun, and then we're going to make an international supply chain based on hydrogen and produce it there and ship it here. That all is massively complicated, additional complicated. So I think it's a bit of a reflex where we should be careful to say we're going to roll this out globally first. We have to start first ourselves and then continue and roll it out globally. That's one of the things I just want to add.
Peter, would you like to come in on that, or?
Yeah, well, I think there's been, most of the important points have been made here. I think just going back to the sort of existing assets discussion, and this is something that's relevant in different dimensions and different geographies here. I think that really is a huge challenge, and it's a very nuanced challenge in each subsector and each sub-technology category, as Chris pointed out there. I mean, some CCUS concepts are not really retrofit concepts. They require a new type of plant to be built, and this is not particularly well understood, and it's different in each subsector, in each technology category. Hydrogen, again, there are some incremental blending options that are available that can kind of lead you to scale up from your existing stock of assets towards a kind of fully fledged commercial scale hydrogen installation. And then this third category that I mentioned at the beginning, generally you're starting from scratch there. I think that dimension is very relevant to this geographical discussion about where plants will move, and because there's a lot of momentum in national industries, and there's it's a big headline, at least in my home country, and I think in lots of other countries around the world, that when a steel plant closes, or when there's a big disruption in industrial supply chains, it is not a trivial task to talk about moving huge chunks of established industrial centers across the world. Is by no means impossible, but there's a whole series of dimensions to that Rebecca mentioned in her opening remarks on kind of just aspects of the transition there. So the link between existing assets and current centers for production, and also this the technology challenges with retrofits and new builds, I think, a complexity to this.
So I'd like to, that's great, thank you so much. And now I want to a little bit unpack the finance question. I guess it was again, Chris, you mentioned it. So to level the playing field, we talked about finance being available or not being, capital being not expensive in the developed countries. What do you think, what are the instruments that could be available for reducing the risk in developing countries? For instance, can we make a more effective use of climate investment funds? Do we have any comments from reducing, well, making finance more available? Chris, have you given that more thoughts?
Yeah, I guess it's interesting when you ask that question, the transaction costs associated with using a lot of the global climate investment funds, what have you, are really large, and those transaction costs have been a big hurdle. To my mind, one of the more practical things to do is we need to be able to connect the lower costs of capital that we have in developing countries and what have you, like directly connect the City of London through to a plant somewhere in Brazil or South Africa or Australia as a closer analogy. And part of that is working with the companies that do go in there and make the investments, can access those markets, but you need de-risking mechanisms in there. And this is where things like the World Bank, IDB, what have you, can be effective in coming in, providing some leveraging capital, signaling to financiers that this is a high value project that it serves multiple benefits and will pay out a risk-adjusted cost of capital, what have you. So the capital is out there, and if it can be accessed properly, it's not that expensive. But we need to work. We need to work through those mechanisms. We need to work through de-risking mechanisms to do that. The GCF has not been effective at this kind of thing to date, because often you have to route through a country and come back. So I don't know. Other people in the room may have other comments to make.
Thank you. Yeah, Christian, please.
So, talking about the financing and investments. Well, what I believe is very important is that we also need to show that there is added value in creating, for example, green steel, because currently we have our different steel grades, and there is no way to distinguish between normal carbon-produced steel and green steel, and so we need some mechanisms that really can differentiate between these steel grades, and so that customers have an incentive to buy the green steel and pay higher prices, and then generate more revenues again for the investor. And I believe this is a way that could be an option to also foster more investments. And I have another point I would like to add on the financing topic, is this topic of the carbon pricing. And we always talk about carbon pricing as an additional tax, but I would rather see it as internalizing costs, because by emitting carbon dioxide, we consume our environment, our planet, and adding this carbon tax, we actually just internalize this cost, and then we also get a more levelized playing field.
Just to add to Christian's comment there, one of the key mechanisms going forward is directly connecting consumers who are willing to pay the premium for green iron, cement, what have you, through to the suppliers. So if you can build a contract that directly, say a car company that can brand a car as having been made with green iron, green steel, what have you, and they can brand it, they can charge the extra $400 per car, and then they make the contract through the metal fabrication train back to the supplier, and that allows them to build that 1-2 megaton plant. That may be one of the key mechanisms for linking that through for the early markets.
Very interesting point. Actually, very relevant, that's been discussed in the first session, but it also makes me wonder. So we have the supply chain, and we talked about green public procurement as well as a tool. So that's maybe another measure to add into the equation. But of course, we have to be wary of again, is it more effective at a national level or international level? I wonder if you have some reactions to that. I mean, and I see your
Yeah, I was just going to say that one large market that can be willing to buy products that are not destroying our environment is indeed the public sector. And imposing a sort of self-imposing to buy only green steel, green cement. Of course, the building sector is important in many developing countries and developed countries, and so forth, can create that anchor law, if you allow me to use a district heating terminology, that law that will create that enough to then grow. Of course, seen also, and we have not seen this being applied in the heart of Abate sector, but we have seen some other examples. Sorry, is this energy efficiency measures being adopted? Yeah, the policies that has been adopted in the sector has been the blending mandates. So create small quota growing of demand of this kind of product, increasingly being bought within a country. Now, this is very hard to set, in particular because once you have a green industry, you can have 50 or 100% immediately green. So it's important to set this target well. And of course, this can become the way to de-risk the investments. As Christian said, however, without a clear label, things can become fuzzy. We have seen in the examples that we've made so far, direct electrification, green hydrogen, even CCS, there is always the option to have not that renewable electricity, not that renewable hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, and whatever colors we want to say, or CCS that is not that functioning properly and not capturing all the CCS. So we have a system that guarantees that what you are buying is actually not damaging and is not being built, is not want to have.
Maybe I think can I add to that a little bit, Jotje? Is that you know what? I think I completely agree with what some of you guys saying. Depending on you need to have a label. You need to make sure that you can distinguish between the polluting product and the green product. But at the same time, this is all still very much is in the perspective of some kind of voluntary action, something that has to do with that the consumer is actually making the choice, which is absolutely a good thing to do, but it's maybe not bringing us to the point where we want to be quickly enough. You know that I realize that saying this requires a lot of international cooperation, but still I think that the best way to go is some kind of level playing field to also avoid that some big steel manufacturer in Europe is actually packing up their bag, leaving, going to India, and then setting up there in a polluting way.
Yeah.
I don't think we want to have that.
Yeah, if I may add, the voluntary contribution, voluntary labels are an option, of course, but we've seen in Europe that you can also impose labels to all the supply chain as an obligation, for example, to biofuels. It could happen, we can do it. You can also add it as an obligation for everyone. Then everyone knows how much polluting their car, building their car, or building a building has been.
Yeah. More difficult, I realize that. Yeah.
I think I would maybe just say that I think the example that Chris raised is the one where we could really see the initial private procurement strategy as being a bridge to a kind of a more kind of less voluntary scheme later. You need those initial high margin products that can absorb these increased costs of raw materials to get the first plants up and running. But then, for the same reason that we don't label, shampoo with the amount of renewable energy content in it, it would be this would be kind of incredibly bureaucratic and complicated to do this for every steel product. Steel is traded not just as crude steel, but traded thousands of times down the value chain as it's made into different goods. So eventually, we would need to move to a system where this is incentivized, kind of closer to the top, closer to the supply end, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I believe you're still on mute.
You're muted. Gotcha, you're muted.
Yeah.
I wanted to also come back to you, Gamze. We haven't heard from you for a while, so I'll be asking your views on also the demand side aspects of the technologies and how to get there and the measures.
Yeah, actually, it's one of the points that I also find quite interesting in addition to the supply side developments. So it's also one of the studies that we have been working on. After adding the materials production side, it's also quite interesting to address the demand side of the equation. So observing the upstream implications of the demand side transformation. So it is actually possible to reduce the mitigation challenge by addressing the source of the problem, which is the ever-increasing material demand. So this can also be a complementary approach. So one point here to mention is material efficiency improvements, such as smaller product designs, lighter vehicles, and another is actually coming directly from the end-use sector, such as transport and buildings, some lifestyle and behavioral changes, such as shared mobility applications with improved asset utilization, which might in the end facilitate less number of vehicles, or from the building side, alternative usage of materials instead of cement, for example, wood. So adding these kind of assumptions also showed us a different trend that we can call as dematerialization. So decoupling of materials from the need from the economic growth. And the effects on the supply side also actually show quite rapid electrification. So in case of steel, for example, a more conventional strategy is assuming a continued growth in the materials side and focusing on the production side, technologies such as hydrogen or CCS combined with fossil fuel. But on the other hand, in a scenario that also takes into account these kind of demand side measures, we observe less costly technology options come forward, such as electric arc furnace in the example of steel. So these kind of demand transformations foster also changes on the supply side. So this is an ongoing study at the moment, and I also would like to emphasize the importance of how they should complement each other.
Great. So we, I guess, have about 15 minutes. So we are, I'm going to be asking sort of your concluding thoughts, but we are at the Global Perspectives room. So I'll be quite interested in hearing kind of your thoughts on the geopolitics of these technologies. We have, of course, the US, the political changes in the US. They're great innovators. Many other countries making more ambitious commitments towards climate change. So if you could perhaps share with me your concluding thoughts, it could be also, again, on our guiding questions, but also from a kind of a global perspective. And here in my screen, I have first Leon. So I'll start with Leon, and then we'll continue.
Okay, so I have no time to think.
No.
That's good. I'm triggered a little bit by the geopolitical question, and we've been thinking about it as well, also in different courses and projects. And what is interesting is that it is very surprising. It can be a very surprising outcome. So if you talk about, renewables, or even again hard to abate sectors, putting CCS and things like that, if you then implement that in an energy-starved region like Europe, where we don't have a lot of fossil fuels left, it sort of creates an independent system in the end. If you think about large-scale renewable production in Europe, that sometimes makes other parties in the world a little bit nervous, where you have a dependence, a supply chain dependence from the Middle East or the US or Russia. So that is very interesting to see that creates a sort of newfound independence, which is also not being backed by everybody. And similar, you can think about that in developing regions as well, where why would you want to be dependent on the newfound natural gas field off your coast if you can use it yourself, produce yourself solar power and maybe even hydrogen to sell to someone. So I think that this will completely change the geopolitical landscape, large-scale implementation of renewables.
Thank you, Leon.
That was just my brainwave. I hope that was okay.
Wow, we have actually have 10 more. We still have 10 more. Okay, we've been a little bit extended. That's great. So you can start to celebrate more and have more time to think. But I'm going next to Emanuele.
Thank you. So about this energy transition. Well, let me just say that we have seen all these changes that we are now talking about. They are thanks only to one idea that came out few years ago about the fact that we are doing to waste, and we are change our lifestyle and our world within our lifetime, or we are not going to give the same plan received from our parents. And some countries, I have to say, they are taking this quite seriously. They are taking the opportunity to reshape all their interaction with other countries. And we see this in particular with hydrogen. It was mentioned before that a lot of countries, in particular Germany now, are thinking about selling electrolyzers around the world to then buy hydrogen. And with Morocco, Chile, or Brazil, Ukraine, all becoming the new servers of energy for a high-consuming country. Indeed, everyone now is scrambling to understand who's going to be the buyer and who's going to be the sellers. And for now, we have not real now, an hypothesis of a lot of hydrogen available all around the world from any kind of countries. But every hydrogen, every molecule will be produced in the same way and will not be have the same carbon footprint. The buyers, then they have the power to decide our destiny, the destiny of this planet. And alongside me, selecting the best molecule will be important and will reshape our interaction between countries.
Perfect, thank you. So now we have around, I guess, 2 minutes each. So Christian, if you could briefly have a concluding thought. You don't all have to, you can pass, but you're welcome to.
So I believe the geopolitical topic is one of the most pressing at the moment, and maybe even more pressing than the technology level, because from a global perspective, it's very, that there are countries that are energy importers and they have large advantages to get independent and to move to a green economy. But on the other hand side, we have a lot of oil exporting, gas exporting countries. And I believe it's very hard to tell them that they have now paid more for green energy, which they have to import and to keep their resources in the ground. And so I believe it's really important to set up some kind of global governance to really ensure that this transition is inclusive and that no one is left behind, no country, no person, and that we work together on a global level.
Excellent. I agree. Gamze?
Yes, so I would also say global cooperation and maybe some certain policy instruments would come forward and be important, such as the EU ETS trading mechanism or the carbon border tax, which is also heavily under discussion. So these kind of policy instruments, I believe, would stimulate global interactions.
And Peter?
Thank you. So yeah, I think I would also, my final thoughts are with the kind of actors involved. So I mean, I think, well, we've got producers, we've got investors, we've got the research community, we've got individuals. I think that the thing that stays with me is that governments will really be at the heart of solving a lot of, or overcoming a lot of the problems that we've talked about here today, whether it's infrastructure, innovation, investment policy. All governments are critically involved, if not throughout these processes, in the initial stages of setting the right environment for things to evolve in a positive direction. And to end on a positive, I'm quite optimistic about this year in particular, coming out of the pandemic crisis, hopefully, and all the big events that we have, getting governments around the table to tackle some of these tricky issues. fills me with at least a cautious optimism.
This is great. And Chris?
I'd like to reiterate Peter's optimism. I've been doing this 25 plus years now. It's the best it's looked ever in terms of climate policy. And it's nice to see the progress. What's interesting to me is that our historic energy structure has been relatively low capital intensity, high fuel intensity, and this has created, dependencies and vulnerabilities globally over the 19th and 20th century that it triggered several wars. This world that we're looking at is higher capital intensity and lower energy intensity, and we'll still need trade, but we're not going to be quite as vulnerable as we were. Like it's looking like a potentially safer world for many reasons. The other, and there are big co-benefits too. Dramatically used water as we go off thermal to more electrification. There's dramatically reduced water use, dramatically better air quality for everybody globally. Like as the IEA keeps pointing out with their reports, more people are killed by air pollution than almost everything else globally. And just this move in heavy industry and transport and buildings, what have you, that can dramatically improve people's lives. So there's a lot of room for optimism here. But it's a different world with different stresses than what we're living with today.
I agree. I really like the momentum building and the optimism out there, especially this year as we move towards the COP26. So if anyone would like to go for saying, what would you expect to see as an outcome of this year's COP26 for industry transition? I would go for more on public procurement and green public, to hear more on that side and alignment of countries. Would anyone would like to come in as an outcome from COP26?
Still going for a global tax. I'm still going for a global tax.
Global tax, that's a good one. Global CO2 tax.
I'd love to see carbon pricing hopefully someday, and the moves, the CBAM moves by the EU are very promising. But at COP26 specifically, I'd love to see some countries and steel using and cement using companies get up and say they will prefer green iron, and cement. They will pay a premium, and they're willing to get into contracted partnerships to get it.
Yeah, I completely agree to that. So I think most important is that we start doing it and really get into action.
Gamze?
Yeah, I would also agree with you. I would like to see more on the downstream policy approaches such as green public procurement and similar,
Last minute, and I think we have to close now. But Emmanuel, you have one point as well?
I just would like to see it, not anymore just saying that we want to go to net zero, but actual laws and regulation by all the countries starting to say, okay, by 2050, we are going net zero.
Action. That is great. Well, thank you all so much. I personally really enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot and heard from different perspectives. I hope everybody else did, and you did as well. And yeah, we will now go back and report.
Good. All right. Well, welcome and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. So I'm Jennifer Lakey. I'm the moderator for our session today, and I'm delighted that we've had an excellent kickoff, both from Rana and from Rebecca Dell, who will help us frame our conversation today. I'm going to offer just two reflections as we move into the session, and I look forward to hearing all of your perspectives. First of all, this is an important moment for us to be talking about decarbonization of the industrial space, and we're really eager. I'm really eager in this particular context to talk a little bit about where we are in our country level efforts. Where and how do we see the opportunities associated with country action? In the framing paper, we saw there are a number of NDCs that have indeed highlighted industrial transformation and decarbonization in the hard to abate sectors. And yet we know that the trends associated with the COVID Build Back Better scenarios are showing that we are not making the investments in the COVID response that would put us on track for that kind of industrial transformation. Much of our stimulus and investment appear to be going to reinforce our existing economy, not help us structure for our new economy. I think that's an important context at this particular moment. And the second is, of course, that we have both the Clean Energy Ministerial and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conference that will be happening this year in Glasgow, as a way to think about what we need to do to demonstrate between now and the COP that we will be able to take our national voices in a direction that allows us to signal to industry that we will be working toward decarbonization at the pace and scale that is required. So with those framing comments, why don't I have us each do a quick round of opening comments for the session. And I'll ask that I'm just going to go through the order that is on my screen. In this particular environment, that's the easiest way to structure things. So we're going to have Radia, if you could kick us off. I'm not going to do long introductions. Please, as you introduce yourselves, mention your role within your government and institution, and then please kick off with your opening comments of approximately 3 minutes or so.
Yeah,
Radia,
thank you very much. And yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Actually, I'm not from government institution. I'm from the UN system, Regional Commission for Western Asia. And I'm the Chief of Energy and Climate Change Natural Resource Management. And in my portfolio, I handle the Arab countries. And that's why I think Rebecca, when she gave the overall picture in terms of challenges and opportunities, we would rather put it from the Arab countries' perspective, from the oil and gas producers and consumers. From this perspective, there are certain challenges before talking about the opportunities and why it doesn't work. Actually, there are certain aspects that maybe I want to highlight from perspective is that when we talk about oil and gas producers, but also the industry, we spoke about the NDCs, and the NDCs well highlighted the industries, but not the heavy industries. And I think that the real challenge is in the heavy industries, and that's why the focus on fossil fuels. One of the key challenges I think that were not highlighted, and from our country's perspective, we think are relevant, is the scale and the capital intensity of these heavy industries, which make it really hard to transform them to a greener, or let's say much more carbon neutral. The other aspect that it's question of financial barriers as well. If I take the countries, basically in my portfolio, it's less than 1% of the finance available internationally, specifically from the climate change perspective, that goes to these countries. And I'm referring to net consuming countries, because oil and gas producers, they don't benefit from that. And there is also another element I think is extremely important from a social and economic circumstances in terms of limiting action in terms of climate change, is basically that very important in these countries, they are in the developed countries independently if they have oil and gas resources. And that's why we have the social contract in terms of subsidy. But what makes it also difficult is somehow that the availability of fossil fuels as a main source of revenues, but also as a source of supply and in the energy mix, make it also difficult in terms of looking how to phase out the use of these resources. More importantly, the risk of standard assets. And I think if we take countries like I would say that in the G20, one of them is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We will obviously, when we talk about addressing the sustainability in the industry, we're talking mostly on $1 trillion as a standard asset, as a risk. So these are some of the challenges I think that are important to highlight. But one of the elements that also was addressed, but I think all the recommendations that were provided, I would just put them in one important thing, is the carbon management technologies. It's not just a question of linking to renewable energy. This is not only the solution. Certainly a combination of solutions, among them the efficiency, but the need to address the carbon management across the whole value chain, where basically we move from a system for the region where I operate, where the industries, even though if they are oil and gas or others, like what we can qualify under extractive industries, like what we have in minerals, all of them, they need to basically, they have a need to basically to work on the carbon management and be part of that, which is not part of the NDC they reflected. But the other element also, which is extremely important, that the transfer of technology, before talking about innovation, it's not just in part of the work, it's question also from a technology perspective that we're still in a business model where we provide the resources and we don't take benefit of the last of it. That's why addressing the industry become really difficult. Right. So I think it's and how to unlock the investment for much more innovation and make this available. This is some points that I want to say at this outset.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radia. Jerome, you're next on my screen. If I could turn to you, if you could offer a Canadian view and perspective on this.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is that we are doing and then some areas or gaps that we see where there's a need for global collaboration, right? So in Canada, we have done a fair amount to lay the foundation, I would say, for decarbonization. So we did a few items. So we put a price on carbon a number of years ago. And we recently announced that we're going to be raising that all the way to $170 per ton by 2030. We've set up a system as well in some industrial sectors to keep that marginal price incentive for carbon reductions, but while preserving competitiveness and reducing carbon leakage. We've worked as well on focusing on reducing the carbon intensity of our liquid fuel through a clean fuel standard. Reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels that are used in our industries. We're investing significantly in efficiency, in innovation, as well as in the enabling infrastructure surrounding industrial decarbonization. I'm thinking of clean electricity specifically. So that was a lot of work that was done, I would say, in the last number of years. Very recently, Canada announced an updated or strengthened climate plan that has some more initiatives. There's quite a few in there, but a few things that I would mention for this particular group is an updated strategy for greening our government. So that's related to the public procurement item that we discussed earlier. There will be a life cycle approach that's taken for federal building retrofits, for instance, with a shadow price of carbon of $300 per ton. So a lot of work that's being taken into consideration here from the government's perspective. There's a lot of other items that we're adding as well to that menu of options. I'm looking at strategies for hydrogen, an updated strategy for carbon capture, funding for low carbon fuels. So a fair amount of work in Canada to really improve in that particular space. There's significant action in the private sector as well. But there are some gaps, and there are some gaps that will require a global collaboration for sure. It is a global commodity market. So a few items that I would point out. One, of course, we talked about promoting demand for low carbon products. Procurement policies, creating buyers clubs, either public, private, or mixed, is one approach where we see some potential. Rebecca talked about clean product standards. So the idea of reporting, benchmarking to really allow us to develop targets for embodied carbon, I think, is something that's missing. And there's work also required for harmonizing our methodologies. And one last item I would put is data. So we do need better data on one part, but also how we talk about data and how we talk about emissions in general. Embodied carbon as part of our language, so that when we talk about buildings emissions, we're also talking about industrial emissions. And I think that has a big aspect or a big impact on your work. So overall, Canada has done kind of laid the foundation, done some work. There are some gaps for sure, and global collaboration in some of these aspects will hopefully get us
for that
the
very helpful opening. I'm going to move now to Mr. Abate Sectors, who is in India at the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Please, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And it's indeed decarbonization is one of the challenge for India currently. And but thanks that we have a very effective regulatory regime. I'm Abhay Bakre, Director General, heading the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which is a statutory body commissioned under the Energy Conservation Act of India, and we work under the guidance of Ministry of Power, and which is also collaborating all forms of energy, not only the power sector itself. So the first stuff, as I echo and support most of the sentiments which were made by our fellow panelists, and also the initial presentation by Rebecca and Rana. So strongly we have a regulatory act started, and we have come up with different rules and regulations. That was the main mandate for the Bureau. And we have started covering all the energy intensive sector. We started with industry, moved into the transport sector, then buildings, and of course the product efficiency. Now let's share what are the achievements and how are we going to move ahead in the India. So energy intensive industries, especially the power plant, the steel, cement, etc. We came out with a very effective scheme, Perform, Achieve and Trade PAT scheme, which has now really taken a good shape. All the consumers are quite excited. And even though we have covered 1,000 plus large industry currently, that consumes almost more than half of the country's energy consumption. So that's one single program covering half the energies of the industrial sector, and which is again the biggest sector. What we have learned is that initially the industry wanted some kind of a support, either in terms of capacity building, technology support, or some kind of financial support. Slowly we started having the advancement in technology, so they wanted us to get them new technologies there. We developed some kind of a trading mechanism that the additional savings which is achieved can be traded and can be compensated by those having the targets. So one by one way, we started moving from voluntary to mandatory regime, and then it has been effective. We have now a great challenge ahead about decarbonizing them. So the first step was to have the energy efficiency. Our cement plants have become almost best in the world. Steel plants are heading towards that. Some of the private sector plants have done really good. They are matching to the best in the world. Then the power plants have started coming with the new technologies. And finally, the rest of the sectors like the fertilizer, the petrochemicals, etc., and including the refineries, they are catching up. Now, the next step, what they want is that how can we incentivize to shift from a conventional fuel to the cleaner fuel. That has started happening. Now we are going towards some kind of a decarbonization in terms of reducing their captive power generation into a grid basis. On the other hand, we have already started greening our grid. We have a massive target of 450 gigawatt by 2030, and we are already in the stage of achieving our first milestone, which is by 2022, coming to 175 gigawatt. It will green our grid, that will make more and more renewable powers in the grid. And now we want these heavy industries, the large industries, to shift their capital power generation, which is primarily based on the coal, or maybe in certain cases or based on the gas. That can be shifted to the grid electricity. We can now we have the affordable power available with them. And once their reliability and the affordability is established, I'm sure that these industries will go ahead. Gaps, as a final point, yes, all these new technologies will require a lot of investment, both from public sector as well as private side. And that is one area where the financing is yet to be established as a very, very effective tool. We have seen that for the renewable area. The renewable power is coming through a good amount of finance, both private as well as public side. But that is yet to happen for the energy efficiency side. So I'll stop here and look forward for a very useful discussion. Thank you, ma'am.
Very good. Thank you. And I'm very glad that you pointed out the importance of investment and finance in our efforts in our conversation today. We'll now move over to Florian. Florian, if you could, please provide your opening comments.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you also for having me. Thank you for the nice introduction, and also thank you for the previous speakers. I would like to give a short introduction also to the mindset of how to decarbonize, how to abate sectors and how to decarbonize, especially energy-intensive industries, because we had in our discussion before, of course, on the question of the demand, the question of product demand, which could incentivize the decarbonization, but also would I like to give a small shift from our perspective, from Austrian perspective, to the question of how can we also make sure that if a demand arises for decarbonized products, the needed energy carriers and energy vectors are appropriate and are ready also to decarbonize those. And in this regard, as in my current position, I'm working at the federal government for climate agendas and especially for renewable gases. We focus ourselves also on how to incentivize renewable gas production, especially renewable hydrogen production, in order to deliver those energy carriers then to energy intensive industries in order when they're needed, and how to prepare the scaling up of those industries, the scaling up the production of those industries. Especially in light of the current COVID-19 crisis, we strongly believe that the creation of a global and a European market for renewable hydrogen is a very important instrument for the recovery and the implementation of the Green Deals and the measures to reach also the target of the Paris Agreement. So that's a kind of a one-in-a-lifetime chance to reassess and restructure also the energy production schemes and energy production systems. And therefore we need a quick scale-up of renewable hydrogen and renewable gases in order to decarbonize those sectors. And the question is now, how should we do that? And now from our perspective, it's very important to have this now kind of policies, to create a functioning hydrogen industry in Europe, and also on a broad level, or UNECE level, and also on the global level, by building also a value chain and a value chain core in a regional sector, and therefore to have also technology and technology leadership in the region for this production technology. And it's not only about this technology development and the development investment, it's important to have also the right regulatory framework for those renewable gases and to incentivize the production of those. And that's why we currently working on an Austrian hydrogen strategy, and with those guiding topics and questions which may occur and may arise also from a perspective of other member states. We have a high share of industry in their energy demands, and one of the main questions there, also from also perspective as a country which is already having a high share of renewable electricity in the grid, is the question: what contribution to the whole decarbonization of the economy can hydrogen and renewable gases do, in accordance to still not reduce the further the further decarbonization of the electricity grids, as green electricity might be limited due to technical potentials in a regional level. And how is it possible then to secure the production and also the supply for hard to abate sectors? And that's also the question which everybody should then address. If you have a kind of the same situation here, which segments of value chains and segments of industries should be preferably consumed or should be supplied with renewable gases? And in order to do that, we're currently also developing a clear roadmap with objectives for renewable hydrogen and renewable gases, and we're going to implement an incentivizing scheme here, pulling on the demand side and on the production side to unlock the deadlock actually. That would be a systematic system which could be applied also for other sectors, and that regard on the gas supply quota system, that normal suppliers have to have a certain amount of renewable gases in their portfolio, and to set that to their consumers. And one of the main questions next to this question of how the production can be raised is how the threshold markets should get a liquid level. First of all, there has to be amounts who should be transported, but second, and that's maybe one of the key questions for renewable goods and renewable energy carriers in the whole UN region then in order to have a liquid market for that is the definitions, what is renewable, what is low carbon, and how is the certification scheme going to be implemented. But the first thing if you want to trade a good is to make sure that a good is tradable also from its value and its value of its decarbonization at the end consumer and also at the producer side. So I see we're working strongly in this direction. We see that there is a big need for cross-border, trans-European, and also international interaction and cooperation. And I would really be really glad to hear also your perspectives on this issue and how you are also working into the field of also production, certification, and also the very important thing of definitions.
Wonderful. You've brought up one of the important parts of the discussion section that I hope we'll have time to get to. So thank you for bringing up those questions on definitions and certifications and harmonization of measurement approaches. So I'm going to now turn to Simon, if you could, from within the British government. We've just heard about what's happening in Austria, and if you could tell us a little bit about how the UK is looking at this and the importance of thinking about value chains and industrial sectors in your work.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So my name is Simeon Agada. I'm the Head of Clean Energy and Advanced Economies at the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. First, let me commend UNIDO for organizing the Vienna Energy Forum and for organizing this session. What we know as a community is that ambitious actions are needed to decarbonize energy-intensive industries. And the speakers before me have talked about scale. We've talked about demand, finance, policy, the market that is required, really important points that the speakers before me have mentioned. What we know is the specific sector policies are a function of national and system-wide targets that provide momentum for action. In the UK, our net zero target has helped to get us going, and also our recently announced nationally determined contribution, which is 68% of 1990 levels of emissions. We're looking to get to that by 2030. And these targets have provided renewed impetus for action across multiple sectors. They are a combination of many years of analysis, engagement, advocacy, and a strong desire to show international leadership in respect to climate action. And they are leading to an economy-wide transformation across industry, transport, and power. What we know is that at the sectoral level, we need to strengthen policy frameworks to support growth and innovation. I'll now outline some of the key policies and actions that are helping to make this happen in the UK. On carbon capture, utilization and storage, we're investing up to £1 billion in CCUS to develop 4 industrial clusters in the UK by 2030 that could potentially help us capture up to 10 megatons of CO2 per year. Now, if you've been part of the CCUS discussion over the last few years, a lot of people agree that the technology exists. It's just the business models that people have always struggled to make sense of. And this industrial cluster model is sort of the result of a lot of conversation within the country and with experts trying to come up with a way to get CCUS going. On energy efficiency, we've set up an industrial energy transformation fund that is designed to help energy-intensive industries cut their carbon emissions through investment in low-carbon technologies. On hydrogen, we're looking to kickstart the hydrogen economy by delivering up to 5 gigawatts of hydrogen production by 2030. And we're also setting up a net zero hydrogen fund to support hydrogen R&D and supply chain development. But we're not just trying to do this alone. We are trying to strengthen international action in this area through our hosting of COP26 and the G7 ministerial. We're working with UNIDO ahead of COP26 to raise ambition on energy efficiency commitments within NDCs as part of the 3% Club. We're working on accelerating decarbonization through the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, led by Sweden and India. We're looking to turbocharge mission innovation and to coordinate R&D activity around key energy-intensive sectors, including iron and steel. At the same time, we're working with partners at UNIDO to bring together a coalition of countries to undertake collective action on public procurement to create a market for low carbon industrial products. And I'm glad that one of the speakers before me, I think it was Florian, he talked about, creating markets to get things going. As part of our G7 presidency, we are looking to work with countries around the world around net zero transitions, industrial decarbonization, and efficiency standards. And the final thing I'll mention in this regard is our work to support developing countries to make the same leap and progress on industrial decarbonization. This is because direct emissions from industry could be 28% lower by 2050 if industrial decarbonization is supported in developing countries. And so last year, in partnership with the World Bank, we announced £15 million of funding to support research, development, and demonstration focused on developing countries. And I know that we have some time for discussion. A number of colleagues have highlighted huge gaps that we need to address to get this agenda going. I've talked about targets. Other speakers have talked about policy and finance. I think we need innovation to make sure that we can make this happen. And I'm just going to flag coordination. It's so important for our engagement to be coordinated, to make sure we know what different institutions are doing, different countries are doing, to make sure that we're working together to move this agenda forward in a coherent way. So again, I'm really excited to be joining this conversation and looking forward to the rest of it. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Simeon, for the call for coordination, I think is well placed, along with our request for certification approaches and thinking about the investment portfolio and profile. We'll now turn to the last of our opening statements. Hilton, if you wouldn't mind, tell us a little bit about what's happening in South Africa and your work in the region. You are on mute, sir. We're still not hearing you, sir. All right, well, while you're looking at how to get access to your microphone, why don't we actually turn very quickly? Let's try one more time. Hilton, are you able to access your microphone yet? All right, looks like he's going to have to rejoin in hopes that the sound comes through. But I do want to now circle to the question of sort of the important role that we could take as a community to tackle some of these challenges that have been brought forward. And I'm hoping that you could each comment on one action that you believe would be allow us to work together as a community. Hilton, before we do, are you able to talk?
Can you hear me?
Now we can, sir. All right, so I was going to go ahead.
It was working and then somehow mysteriously switched off. Okay, so I think it's important to say that I don't speak either for government or for industry. A lot of freedom in a discussion which is often schizophrenic in that on the one hand we have huge gaps and not too much happening, and on the other hand we have what I would call, certainly for industry over the past 3 or 4 years globally, firstly, rapid acceleration and change in the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. So I think it's important to say that globally, 5 years ago, the hard-to-abate sectors were seen as people didn't know what we were going to do with them. Similarly, in South Africa, 2 or 1 year ago, the hard-to-abate sectors, they lived in the following policy space. The South African NDC submitted in 2015 had significant emissions envisaged in 2050. They largely came from the hard-to-abate sectors. However, last September, we filed a low emissions development strategy which commits to net zero by 2050. And we're currently formulating our next NDC, which will be submitted sometime this year. I can say, and then, so that's the big picture. The smaller picture in our policy in the country is the government is currently formulating what are called sector emission targets. There aren't numbers next to those targets. Similarly, we are allocating carbon emissions budgets to large emitters. That's also still in the works. So that's the regulatory picture. What's happening on the ground is before COVID, I think it's also important to paint the picture that we have a 40% unemployment rate and a 50% population living below the poverty line. And that was before COVID, and it's got a lot worse. So also the emissions intensive industries are associated historically with creating the situation of poverty, unemployment, and inequity. And at the same time, we have magnificent natural resources, and we will rely on these industries partly to deal with the issues of unemployment and poverty. So at the end of the plenary, I just wanted to say, it's, you know, we can talk technology forever, but if it doesn't contribute to a transition in our country that deals with unemployment and inequity, it's not a starter. So what is happening, though, the good news is that a lot of techno-economic modeling and looking at technologies is starting to show that we can both maintain our emissions-intensive industries, decarbonize them, and they can contribute substantially to the economy, the macroeconomy and also the microeconomy. Macroeconomy being revenue for exports, taxes, royalties, etc., the micro jobs and links into the rest of the economy. So that's all good news. We haven't yet got to the stage where any of the big industries are doing anything. And we said we didn't want to talk about furnaces, but we do need to recognize that each country has very specific situations, needs, etc., etc. I'll pick one industry very quickly. Our iron and steel industry is central to our manufacturing sector. We have indigenous iron ore, we have got coal, but we've also got lots of solar power, and we've also got a very good transmission grid. So, but this industry only manufactures 5 megatons of steel in a global industry of 1,800 megatons. So we float in global supply chains, and it is most important for the global supply chain industries, and that includes our chemical industry, that the not only the technologies for production, but how the value chains fit together are decarbonized in a collaborative fashion, because countries with small economies, small productive sectors, can't do it on their own. We just blow in the winds of international protectionism and all kinds of things, Chinese dumping, whatever. So that's the global value chains. And then the local value chain industries, whilst it's often said it's very affordable to do decarbonization, well, that depends on your economy and how much money is floating around and how much poverty there is, and how much infrastructure there is to build. So I'll leave the framing sort of introductory statement with another interesting sort of overall picture. Africa, with 1.1 billion people, uses about 35 megatons of steel per annum. The average in-stock use of steel is somewhere around half a ton per person. Our population is expected to grow by 400 million to 2050. Many countries already have all the buildings and infrastructure that they need to meet basic needs. We've still got to build ours, and it's going to be built out of materials that come out of these basic industries. We can't import it all from you. We've got to decarbonize them ourselves, but we haven't even started. So that's the framing conditions that I'd like to say from the country voices side.
Really important context to consider as we talk about the kind of coordination, the kinds of standards, and the kinds of investment that are needed. Good. Thank you all for providing those very helpful opening remarks. I want to turn to one of the themes that we were discussing throughout the session, which is where and how do we see priorities for coordination across our international community? Where is there an opportunity? Several different initiatives have been brought up. And I wanted to just ask for a very brief response to a number one priority for coordinated action that your government is investing in or taking forward, and make sure that we actually have a list of the mechanisms that we believe could actually help us with this hard to abate sectors in our action. So Jerome, if I could turn to you first to answer your sort of one important coordination activity that you'd like to flag.
Thank you for that. I think there's a lot of big activities and some smaller, perhaps more arcane activities that are just as important. So I would like to flag 1.5, if you'll allow me. I'm from the energy efficiency world, and we had, I think, a decent amount of success on standards. I'm thinking of the ISO 50001 energy management standard. I think related standards and related benchmarks are an area where there's a good international infrastructure to build on. And so in talking about the carbon content of materials and developing the methodologies, harmonized methodologies, and reporting and benchmarking standards, I think is probably one area where there's a significant opportunity for collaboration, and I think a lot of demand. And the second half, I'm sure others will mention, but I think procurement is an area that we're looking closely. Simeon mentioned it in the UK. Canada is involved in that particular discussion as well, and I think that's something that we'll be looking forward to digging into a lot more.
Great. And Simeon, since we referenced you and your UK hat, what would you like to flag for your priority for coordination?
I'd say innovation. Because of all the things that we need to happen, because it's an industry that needs to be turbocharged, I would say that a lot of support needs to happen with regards to technical and market innovation to get decarbonization of industry going. So I referenced mission innovation in my earlier statement, and mission innovation is just coming to a place now where it's about to be renewed for a second phase. So a few people are aware of the history of mission innovation and its links to COP, and because we're getting to COP26, it's going to be renewed. But the point is trying to understand across these big sectors, CCUS, hydrogen, and we've referred to steel and cement. How do you create innovation missions that multiple countries can sign up to that can then kind of drive the sector forward very, very quickly? And we know that with innovation, there is a part for government to play, but there's also a part for industry to play. So if you think about kind of cost curves and the cost of delivery coming down over time, industry also has a role to play in that kind of collaborative effort around innovation. So I think that would be my main area to flag in terms of coordination.
Terrific. Florian, if we could hear from you and the opportunities for coordination that you'd like to highlight.
Yes, of course. As also my previous speakers also flagged the things I previously also flagged, so I'm very, very in accord with them. But maybe to highlight also another point or 1.5 points, I think it's very important also to see it also from a strategic value chain perspective, yeah, and there's a coordination between regions or at least or continents, yeah, to implement value chains there for specific decarbonization technologies are essentially to then unlock also the question of decarbonization for the respective industries also there, yeah. So not only from development and research and development perspective, but also from a rollout and industrialization perspective. So it's also a question of strategic industrial policy for decarbonization technologies, which can be addressed by coordination between member states.
It would be a very good opportunity for something like the clean energy ministerial process to look at in terms of strategic industrial policy rollout and what the experiences have been. That would be an excellent opportunity for SEM. If I could now turn over to Mr. Bakre from India, if you could tell us a little bit the single intervention or coordination approach that you would like to flag.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Because I just shifted from a different computer. So, yeah, the challenge will be the kind of motivation if it goes to different sectors as well. Now we started with the heavy industries, but now it took almost 6 to 8 years for them to realize, yes, energy efficiency, as Jerome told, that energy efficiency is the starting point. But now we are talking beyond the energy efficiency. It is not just the cost effectiveness and payback period, etc. We are trying to actually shift the entire processes, the entire method of generating energy or the useful energy, whether it's the power, whether it's any other kind of process, etc. So all these things, we need some kind of an ecosystem to be developed. As we talked about the hydrogen has to be available at affordable price. If we are talking about the power, shifting them, the furnaces or some other activities, auxiliaries to power, the industry wants a reliable power at an affordable price. It's not today they invest and tomorrow there is something else coming up. So kind of assurance in a larger ecosystem and backed up with a strong financial support. If it is developed in a much not only within the national level, but through a cooperation between different countries who are leading the energy efficiency, who are leading the decarbonization, etc. So all these processes, then the consumer or the industrial actors, they will have a good confidence. They are backed with finance, they are backed with technical expertise, they are backed with kind of resources and the support throughout the world. So that will help them create a further roadmap, and then they will be very aggressive. It's not a question of 6 months or 1 year. It's a long period. They have to invest and then they have to get the return in that. And the country also has to frame the targets. So these are the policy approach that India we are trying. Yes, thank you.
Good. And now I think we are getting close to the very end of our time together. So let me ask Hilton, if you'd like to provide a comment on this important theme of where we can coordinate on the standards, on innovation, on value chain and standards rollout. Of the comments that have come before, where would you say South Africa or Africa more broadly in the region, Sub-Saharan Africa, where would you highlight the need for coordination?
So firstly, all of the suggestions that have been made are necessary. So it's not a matter of just picking some. Then secondly, industries are very different. So I'll just choose steel. For steel, we need global sector decarbonization in South Africa. If you just leave our sector industry on its own in South Africa, we can't create the conditions to decarbonize it. But that doesn't mean that the whole world has to agree. A certain critical mass of countries and or blocks plus industry players can, in a carbon club kind of configuration, reach agreement and get sector decarbonization going. And South Africa would very much fit into that kind of arrangement. I don't know if I can elaborate, but that requires certification, standards, trade rules, innovation, access to technology, access to finance.
Right, all of the themes that we've done.
And we can't do that all in South Africa. It has to come from our partners and us.
Well, Radia, this is a good moment for you to reflect on how you would see your role in helping provide that institutional support, the regional coordination. Tell us a little bit about how you would act on this, these priorities.
Yeah, thank you very much. As Hilton said, there is not something that we select all of them as part of the solution. And basically, it needs to be fit with the national context of each country and the enabling environment. I believe one of the key elements that we have in terms of regional but also global collaboration is the flow of information in terms of how we share the information. Whatever you do, guidelines, whatever it's done at any region or national, if they succeed, if not shared properly, if we don't have the right capacity building and the sharing the right business model that we just need to customize, then we haven't achieved the result. And I just want to add that the stakeholder engagement, it's not just at the national level, it needs to be at all the levels, and I think this forum was a platform. But coming also from an oil and gas country as well, maybe that's from the country perspective, I would say there are certain very good practices that are all over the world, not only in developed countries, but also in underdeveloped countries that are not shared, and we should consider this to learn from our own experiences. But more importantly, the business model that we need to now put in place with all the elements that colleagues said is that we need to ensure that it's inclusive and ensure that really we don't leave anyone behind. So the poor and the rich. But more importantly, from a gender perspective also, I think this is really an opportunity to address the equity and to ensure that whatever we do as a transition to a much more sustainable system, we need to ensure that whatever customization we do in the value chain, this element is embedded. So we adjust the economic, we adjust the climate perspective, but we also adjust the social, which is extremely important for sustainable societies. And obviously, climate change is also about adjusting the social before anything else. Otherwise, where most nations in the world are not able to adjust climate change because of the social dimension and the cost of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm glad we brought back in the question of this sort of jobs and social agenda are critical. And we heard a little bit from Hilton as well about the demographics and the need for us to think quite seriously about how we're building out infrastructure for our future. I know we have only about 5 or 6 more minutes left. And I think it probably is a good moment to pause and say, the investment agenda is the other element that we have not spent as much time on. And clearly, as I said in my opening remarks, we are challenged to turn the ship, right? We have investment mechanisms and approaches that governments have used and investors have used for many years. Where and how do we see investment mechanisms opening the doors for this kind of transformation that we're talking about in the hard to abate sectors? If we could, I'd like to just ask for folks to raise their hand if you'd like to share one example of an investment mechanism that you think has the ability to scale for us to make these investments happen in industrial change. If not, I'll just call on people if no one's going to raise their hands. Simeon, I'm going to turn to you then, and then Radia, since she raised her hand.
Fantastic, happy to come in. So within the UK, in 2019, we developed a green finance strategy where we were talking about how organizations can green finance. So if you're going to put money into a project, you need to think about the green credentials or how it's helping to take emissions out of the economy. And I know that, in other sort of blocks in the EU, for example, when they support innovation projects, they look at the GHG avoidance credentials of those projects to get things going. So I think when it comes to public finance, which might be the area where it's a bit easier to roll out those standards, you can quickly link public financing of projects or the development of new sectors to the emissions avoidance credentials of the projects that are coming through the system. Then, there is the international climate finance or the overseas development assistance, where countries are supporting developing or emerging economies around sort of adapting to climate change or around economic support, or actually around recovery from the pandemic. And if we can look at the green credentials of all of that public finance going out, I think there is a potential to channel them to areas like industrial decarbonization. But I think the private sector doesn't want to be left out. So oftentimes, if you look at the Financial Times, there are a lot of funds that are now thinking about ESG investing, and again, how they can link to their investing and how they can green their investment credentials. I think what we have to do from a government and industry perspective is to highlight the projects that are eligible for this kind of financing. So if you had a database somewhere of projects that are coming on stream in the industrial decarbonization space, and a way to link those projects to financial institutions that are looking for opportunities that have been well evaluated, that could be a way of, again, driving action in this space. I'll stop there.
Very tangible suggestion. Jerome, any reflections? And Radia, I know you wanted to come in as well. And Hilton.
Well, sorry, I had not raised my hand, but I can add one item, perhaps one particular item that I wanted to flag, which is kind of finance adjacent, linking policy outcomes with planning. And one thing that Canada has committed to recently is to do a national infrastructure assessment that will take a look at long-term needs in terms of building out our infrastructure for a net zero world in 2050, and then linking that as well to the construction, which has a link to industrial decarbonization and other needs as well, and bringing that into a broad stakeholder conversation, including with investors, to understand how we can make this happen in a way that is consistent with our goals. So it is not a direct finance mechanism, but it is a bit of a planning approach, I think, which will help leverage those kinds of
Great.
funds as well.
Radia, and then Hilton.
Yeah, I think just following what also Simon indicated, I think what we have in circular economy, well, basically we have a huge potential where we can work in order to discuss the carbon, but more importantly, where we have room to involve much more the SMEs. So the business model that we have now, I think, so the SMEs would have a major role. But we have the issue of bankability of the projects and to get on the financing. But that's where I think the focus should be, where we have the integrated approach. The private sector will be there in terms of, for example, the water, energy, food nexus. This would solve a lot of problems in different regions of the world. But also the other aspect that is directly linked to the industry, it's the transportation sector. And I think this would help us, as colleague mentioned, for the standardization, for all of that. All of that, the private sector is much more involved. So if we just adapt this dimension, we unlock both sectors.
Right. We have only 1 minute left. Hilton, you are going to get the last word on this question of investment.
I would just like to reiterate what started the plenary, and that was the idea of creating markets and shaping them to draw finance into bankable projects, and to remind us that arguably the most successful decarbonization to date is via renewables, driven by portfolio standards, feed-in tariffs, etc. So not to approach subsidies from the side of giving people money to do stuff, but rather giving people markets to satisfy, because that drives innovation, it drives competition, it drives diversity, and it also drives technologies to satisfy real needs. And also, it decreases the chances for corruption.
I think that's an excellent quote for our session. I will use your quote if it's acceptable to you. Give people markets to satisfy. A perfect opportunity to reflect on this need for the integrated view. I could continue to talk with all of you for hours on end about this important topic, but I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of your responses, the insights into the market and opportunities that you've seen from your government or from your regional context. And I think we've covered a tremendous amount of ground in a very short period of time. I will
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. If you're having issues with your microphone or camera, you can do the normal things we do these days. So there seems to be someone called Emma who is on the chat, if you can see the chat, and she says if you encounter technical problems, you can refresh the window or contact by writing a message in chat. So you could try that. Otherwise, we'll just, there we are. Emma's writing in the chat. Otherwise, we'll get started. Thanks so much for joining from all over the place. Maybe we'll do a quick round of introductions for those in this room. And I think the plan is to spend the next sort of 45 minutes going through some of these questions in more detail. Thanks to Rebecca for laying out the some of the overarching issues in industry decarbonization, which you noted has been a topic of discussion for some time. So why don't we just go through the list just so we can hear from you just who you are and your organization, and well, we'll just go through and do each of you have these 3 key questions in front of you, or should I repeat them for you? Do you have them?
It would be nice if you could just
sure.
I'll repeat once again.
Sure. So the key questions for this session are: what is needed at the global, sectoral, and technological level to create a global market for low carbon commodities from iron, steel, and cement? Like iron, steel, and cement, so you can go into the plastics as you like, or other. How do the needs to create these markets and gaps vary across different economies, or we could say different regions? And what roles are there for government and private sector to play? So Rebecca took a pretty good stab at much of that, but what we'd like to do is get a view from the other people in the room. Now, Sanjeev, you're not on my list, but it's a small room, so we might as well just get more diverse voices. So I'm gonna call these just in the order I was given the names, if you don't mind, so there's no reflection on anything other than that. But Ivan Jacques, my old friend from the World Bank, why don't you start us off, and I'll take some notes. And the plan is that if you could each speak for something like 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes as you like, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards, and I'll take notes and report back to the wider group in 45 minutes. So Ivan, I know you've been at this for a while, so let's hear from you.
Thanks, Morgan. Would you like?
So if I'm sorry, Ivan, if for the others, could you please do the normal and mute your microphones?
And Morgan, would you like us to go through the 3 questions in series, or we go 1 question everybody, then the other question everybody, or how would you like it?
No, let's go through all. They're all related. So if you have views on instruments and then where there's differences, etc.
Okay. So I'm Ivan Kakis. I'm a senior energy specialist at the Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, SMAP, of the World Bank. And for around a year or so, we have been supporting countries worldwide in their industrial decarbonization efforts, thanks to the support from BASE in the UK. And it's a fascinating sector. And the questions are also fascinating because they point to the key of what we need to do. And Rebecca, thank you, because you said almost everything that I wanted to say, but I'll just give some additional things. So I think we have to take a step back and look at the types of barriers that we face. There are macroeconomic country-level barriers, like the broader innovation ecosystem in a country, with a lack of human capital, macroeconomic stability, intellectual property protection, etc. There are sector-level barriers, and you mentioned some of iron and steel being commodities, so it's a difficult competitiveness issue. There are technology-specific barriers, technical, regulatory, commercial barriers. So what is needed, to go to your question? At a global level, there are basically two big, broad buckets. One is the set long-term targets, which must trickle down to national, local, and firm level. And second, trade policies, which have two sides. On one side, encourage flows of goods, services, and knowledge relevant to low-carbon products and services. And on the other side, discourage imports of carbon-intensive products, for example, through our carbon pricing. So at the sectoral level, one very important action is demand creation. And we see, for example, through the Steel Zero initiative, where there's a supply chain push to have a decarbonized chain all along. There's also, for example, responsible steel standards. Second, infrastructure coordination and clusters. And here, for example, for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, they will play a key role. And both require substantial supporting infrastructure with large fixed costs, and in the case of hydrogen, a sizable demand. And rolling these out in a coordinated way will help reduce decarbonization costs substantially. And here, industrial clusters can play a key role. And third, one of my favorites is circular economy, where circular economy can reduce CO2 emissions from 4 major industry sectors, cement, aluminum, plastics, and steel by 40% globally. And this can be achieved through better use of existing stocks and through reduction of materials, as Rebecca told us before. And this often requires a combination of government regulation and coordination across supply chains. So that was at the sectoral level. At the technological level, we know that current technologies are not enough to reach decarbonization levels compatible with climate targets. In here, we will need research and development, but we also need demonstrations and to advance commercialization of technologies. So we need to bring costs down. Now to your second question, how do these needs and gaps vary across different economies? So economies such as the US and Europe, and in particular listed companies, will increasingly face pressure from investors and customers to decarbonize their supply chains. But this pressure is lower or non-existent in other regions. So probably, I think that sector-led markets for low-carbon products will emerge in Europe and the US first. There are also differences in the policy and regulatory aspects, where there are pressures between emerging and advanced markets. For example, the long-term necessity for full industrial decarbonization has only recently taken hold in countries and regions like the UK, like Europe, with net zero targets, increasingly strong policy to achieve that target. And a credible long-term need to decarbonize is critical, given the large investments required and long payback periods. And industries in these countries without net zero targets, or with net zero targets but with limited short-term climate policy momentum, are more likely to adopt a wait-and-see approach. So you know that our focus at the World Bank is, of course, the low and middle-income countries. And what do we see there? They're currently driving global growth in industrial emissions and require the largest trend change. They need to switch from substantial emissions growth, approximately 40% to 2040 in the business as usual scenario, to large emission decreases, approximately 60% by 2040. So if we look at iron and steel, the majority takes place in 2 developing countries, China, accounting for around half of steel production, and India, which is the second largest at 6%. And we see that projections show that the demand in India will grow 4 times by 2050, in Africa by 7 times, but it will decrease in China by around 30% to 2050. On the other hand, many countries lack long-term mid-century climate goals. Most only have to 2030. And as you know, innovation and adoption of innovative decarbonization technologies need policy certainty over the long run to allow firms to make costly investments with confidence. And we see interesting good developments, for example, China committing to carbon neutrality by 2060, And we hope to see more long-term commitments at COP26. There's also a lack of long-term planning, which is not, of course, exclusive of developing countries, which increases the risk of costly lock-ins of carbon-intensive technologies that make it more expensive to decarbonize in the future. And we also see challenges associated with the type and scale of funding required. On the other hand, developing countries spend less on R&D. Rebecca told us of the key importance of innovation, which I totally agree. So this reduces their capacity to create, to adopt, and adapt innovations. And going to your last question, what roles can government and private sector play? Well, many. For government, to start with, they support and invest in innovation and market creation through supplier technology push policies. It includes support for research, development, and demonstration. Also demand, and that includes, of course, infrastructure to facilitate collaboration and knowledge transfer, financing through loans, loan guarantees, and other de-risking mechanisms, proof of concepts, funds and grants. On the other hand, demand or market pull policies, for example, carbon pricing, emissions trading, mandatory energy efficiency improvement targets, like in China with its 10,000 industries program, fiscal incentives, taxes of subsidies, procurement, Rebecca also mentioned procurement, and improved framework conditions through supportive policies and regulations. This includes, for example, intellectual property protection, clear long-term policy signals, enabling environments to support innovation, well-designed regulations. In the private sector, to end, I'm taking a long time, the private sector, they have a key role in investing in low-carbon technologies and facilities. And here an important point, if they move early on industrial decarbonization, they can set up a competitive export advantage to regions that may develop environmentally stringent regulations, for example, the border carbon adjustments in Europe. The key role is also in demand creation through supply chains, as I explained earlier. And finally, the financial sector also has a key role to support investments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ivan. Terribly useful as usual, and it's so nice to see you for a change. Anthony, you're very actively engaging in the chat for those that are not seeing it from the recording. Maybe you can do us the favor of going through your answers to these few questions based on those work you've done at the World Economic Forum with the various CEOs. The forum's strength is, of course, that convening, and so we'd love to hear your views on these issues, please.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so it's wonderful to be here, and I'm actually, well, probably two hats. I'm wearing my hat as Executive Director of the World Economic Forum for the Mission Possible Partnership, as it is now being relaunched, with our four core partners, the Rocky Mountain Institute, Energy Transitions Commission, and We Mean Business Coalition, and our strategic partner, the IEA. And then we're working with a wider set of partners, particularly through We Mean Business, such as WBCSD, WRI, UNEP, Series, etc. The idea being that the systems change required to really drive industrial decarbonisation at the speed and scale required is complex, is doable, but it is complex, and it requires coordinated action in the sector. So the Mission Possible platform has been designed as that sort of core vehicle to sort of coordinate and help bring some alignment, not control, but bring alignment and support that coordination in the sector. That's the idea. I think addressing these questions, in my career, I've been in the climate space since the beginning of the 90s, and so seen a lot of progression, particularly in the energy transition. And there's a lot of lessons that I think we can learn from that in terms of the S-curves. We have seen technology scale up and through, and that is still continuing. And I think one of the important lessons is we don't need to win everywhere at once to begin with. this is about scaling and implementing technologies at speed and scale. We need to get that process going. We know from the Bible that we work to, which is the Energy Transition Commission's Mission Possible report, that we have all of the technologies at different scales in the roadmap over the next 30 years. We've just got to work on scaling them to bring the costs down and implementing the technologies, particularly in the energy space, where that has already happened. We've also, I think, learned from that transition that you can get that process going in certain areas, regions, and countries, as we saw. So back in the sort of 90s, Germany playing a big role, some other European countries coming in with feed-in and support mechanisms that get that process going. But even if you dig back beyond the 90s, there was a lot of work by industries and buyers groups to get the technologies to a stage where that policy from governments could get traction on implementation, and also in a sense to give governments confidence that if they put the policy mechanisms and support mechanisms in place, there is a degree of support from business and something they can get traction on. So I think that's a key part of our theory of change, if you like, in the Mission Possible platform. So we've developed this 4-step process, starting with building high ambition coalitions of the key players. So on the supply side, so if you take cement, this sort of cement and concrete companies, on the sort of buy side, so those companies in the supply chain that would buy a bit the other end of the supply chain, financiers, the finance sector, and then also governments and policymakers. And once you've got that commitment, it doesn't have to be everybody, it's the most ambitious, those who want to move faster. You can work on getting an alignment on the roadmap, agreement to implement key milestones from that roadmap. And a good example is our Getting to Zero coalition in the shipping sector, where they've already committed to work together across businesses right across the maritime supply chain and companies to get zero emissions vessels in the water by 2030 in the deep sea lanes on a commercial basis. And they've got a series of work programs, they've got a series of milestones during the next decade to get them to that point. It's very ambitious, but it is doable with the right support, the right resources, and in the right decisions being made. So that's the sort of process we want to implement. So that's sort of, get your commitment, high ambition commitment by the faster movers, agree on your roadmap with government, business, and finance input into that, get concrete agreement to take those roadmaps from the sort of academic into the real world by getting key agreement on the key milestones that we will work to implement. And then the necessary implementing measures, whether that's the product standards, the methodologies, the financing instruments, the right level of R&D support from governments to sort of make all of that a reality. And you create your sort of virtuous flywheel. So I think, companies can play an important role by proof of concept on certain pilots and certain elements of the system. Governments, with that confidence they get from business and push from the faster moving elements of business, can put the right policy mechanisms in place to support and scale that. So I think that's the sort of really interesting public-private dynamic that we need to create. I think the other point here in terms of how does this vary across economies, well, let's just look at the supply chain piece, and that was the notes I put in the chat. And I think what I think is fascinating from the report we did with BCG was, one, obviously understanding there are, I think, 8 supply chains that are 50% of global emissions, so you can focus on those and have quite a big impact. There are 9 barriers that companies trying to implement net zero across those supply chains are facing, and so we can focus on addressing those barriers. For example, product standards, how you measure carbon through the supply chain, if you're trying to implement those commitments. But what I think was really got our CEOs excited when our climate leader CEOs came together, which is a group of 83 CEOs, and about 60 of them met during the Davos Agenda Week a couple of weeks ago, was this realization of the difference in cost margins between the upstream, as Rebecca outlined it, the sort of commodity element, and the downstream. And that got these CEOs very excited, and they've decided to organize themselves into supply chain groups to work on how can they create and support mechanisms that can link the supply chain and the fact that they've got a lot more room to work with financially within their businesses than, say, a cement or aluminium or steel company has. And so how can they use that to effectively drive that decarbonisation and push some of that value that they collect at the end of the supply chain back up the supply chain to support the decarbonisation? So there's a group of CEOs very keen to work on that, and we are mobilising them through Mission Possible and within the forum, but also very keen to work with others in capturing that CEO, I think, led drive and interest. And then finally, I think we've addressed, I think, the role of governments and the private sector. So perhaps I'll stop there. There's a lot more I could sort of say, but I think these are some of the key elements. And we're also quite happy, if anyone's interested, to find out more about the plans for the Mission Possible partnership, to talk to you and give you a sort of briefing, and also how others can work within this, coalition that we're trying to build in the space. Thank you.
Anthony, thanks so much. That's fascinating work. I had seen the launch of the Mission Possible, but hadn't gotten a chance to look at the details, so appreciate that outline of it. It sounds like a perfect place for the World Economic Forum to play the role it's so good at.
So we're partners as well. Very much a partnership with RMI, ETC, and business and others, but yes.
Of course, yes, as usual. Yeah, of course. Sarita, I'm going to unmute you, and hopefully you can give us a quick introduction, Sarita, and then some answers to these questions, if you don't mind.
Hi. I am, so first of all, I'm really sorry my video is not working, so
no problem.
Sorry about that. But on introduction, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the National Institute of Environmental Studies in Japan, and I did my PhD from Indian Institute of Ahmedabad, and I'm part of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways, BICS, which is Brazil, India, Indonesia, China, South Africa project, under which we are looking into industry and from an emerging economies perspective. And that is how I would be addressing these questions. When it comes to the first questions, I think Rebecca, Ivan and Anthony have answered most of the questions. I think where I come from is more, I would like to focus on the feasibility of the technology that is present and how from an emerging economies perspective, it is different. So the vision statement is there. When it comes to iron and steel, there are a lot of private sector, especially in India, who have come together as a consortium to move towards carbon neutrality when it comes to steel, when it comes to cement. So the vision is already there. People have, the stakeholders in private sector as well as in government sector are very positive and moving towards low carbon in each of the sectors in most feasible manner. And in India, it started with the energy savings scheme. However, at the same time, having heavy investment in technologies such as hydrogen, hydrogen being used as a reducing agent, or CCUS, especially in cement, is not so feasible in India. Everything's occurring at a demonstration scale, and without the technology transfer and the finance that is required, it would be very difficult, especially in emerging economies. Obviously, as stated by Ivan, when it comes to iron and steel and cement, China has 60% of the shares, followed by India. So India is looking into how to move towards carbon neutrality. However, when we talk about countries like South Africa, where it may break the economy to have certain kinds of industry. So how to work with the government as well as the industry sector, and they have just one plant, but this plant is really important for the economy. So it's the small nations like South Africa, the Southeast Asia, where it will play a very huge role, the kind of technology transfer and the industry consortiums that are there, as well as the trade policies that are taking place. So the vision is already in place in private sector and some of the government sector. However, it's an implementation where it would be, there needs to be a kind of push that is required, especially at the local level. Top down, the vision statements are there. It's at the local level, there needs to be a push. And that is where I think a focus should be made. So that is from my end. So two things are there. Thank you very much. Oh, I can't.
For joining us, Sarita. That adds a lot of richness to the discussion, and we really appreciate it. Rebecca, you've given us an overall rundown from, I guess, a report that Climate Works has done or funded, and maybe you want to add some bits in this more focused discussion.
I feel like I had my fair chance to share my thoughts in the opening discussion, and so I'm happy to participate in the back and forth, but I don't need to make any more solo remarks. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Sorry, you know, Radhika, it's listed as Radik. I assume it's Radhika, yeah?
Yeah, they got the spelling wrong.
Yes, that's what I figured. Okay, so I apologize. I followed their spelling for once and not both times. But in any case, would you take the floor and tell us the views that you've been working on?
Absolutely. So a very quick introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Radhika Lalit. I'm a manager with the Climate Aligned Industries program at RMI. I'm also the director for the Center for Climate Aligned Finance that we recently launched last year, where we're engaging with the likes of JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs to really help the financial sector decarbonize the real economy and support their clients on this transition. I'm also, like Anthony, engaged in the Mission Possible partnership, and I'm very excited that Anthony already shared our vision and mission for this, because this is something that's going to be very core to how the industries decarbonize and sectors decarbonize, and hopefully with our working with the high ambition players in the market, we can actually affect some change. So to the three questions, I almost feel like Anthony and Sarita answered most of these questions really well, and so I don't know how much more I can add, but I'm just going to try to keep my remarks rather very, very brief and see if they're additive to the discussion. So the first question was obviously what is needed at the global sectoral and technological level to create global markets for low carbon commodities like iron and steel and cement. And I think at the global level, for long, we've had conversations in the realm of the intergovernmental ecosystem, which have been very country-centric. So now if you think about countries, you can think about columns on an Excel sheet, but the real action happens in economies and sectors, which kind of goes across each of these countries. And so the real economy has been, a side conversation at COP, at most of these COPs. And I think what we need to ensure is that these conversations are brought back to the center and, are centered around the real economy and sectors, because this is where the action on decarbonization is and should be. At the sectoral and technological level, I'm going to combine the two categories. I think this transition needs to be led by the industry. And so it cannot be another academic exercise where we're telling the industry what needs to be done. I think we need alignment on net zero roadmaps for the industry, because there are not many out there. Since long we've been talking about, well, let's decarbonize by 2060, or 2070 in most of these sectors because they're hard to abate. And I think there is a real conversation to be had with the industry on this. So what do we need to do? I think we need to change how we make our steel and concrete, because we cannot operate on business as usual. We have to move away from existing technologies like blast furnace technology and switch to more innovative, technologies and make sure that these technologies are cost competitive and deployed at scale. In steel, for example, hydrogen DRI is obviously a great option. The electric arc furnace is another great example. In cement and concrete, we really need carbon capture, utilization and storage. So CCUS can deliver, I think, 15% reductions in both cement and steel, and investing in sort of, common shared transport and storage infrastructure can really provide that economies of scale that we need in order to both attract capital and investment in this sector, but also, in these industrial clusters. So, this is not, again, just going to be led by the industry. There's a lot of that governments can do here. And I think governments must participate in partnership with the industry in order to stimulate demand and innovation in these areas through funding RD&D and adopting measures that would reduce the carbon emissions. I think one of the things that we haven't touched upon in this conversation has been really, we can't go with demand as usual. We really need to think about primary steel versus secondary steel. We really need to recycle steel and concrete. And that's that's an opportunity we cannot afford to miss as the developing markets grow. So we need to understand how we can increase the circulation of secondary steel and, increase recycling in concrete. In order to create a market, I would say another thing to think about is standardization. So what does it mean when we say green? What does it mean? How do we define scope? What is the certification process, standardization process? Because unless those elements are integrated into the system, a market cannot effectively function across different countries. And so we really need to, stress on those issues. And ultimately, Rebecca touched on this really well around economies of scale through demand signals. And I think public and private procurement both play a really key role in this sector and can help really in the adoption. Green public procurement itself, like I think Rebecca shared in her slide, that currently green, it's such a great signal. Currently 13% of the OECD countries' GDP is what is public procurement expenditure. And this share is 30% in emerging and developing economies. So sending that kind of a signal is massive to the market and can really help. And especially because the two materials that we're talking about, steel and cement, they're largely going to structures and infrastructure, which if you think about is mostly built environment, and that's where public procurement can play a huge role. And on the private side, we've talked about advanced market commitments as a great signal, as well as buyer scrubs to aggregate demand from the private sector. So those are some of the things that I can think about. Obviously, on steel, the biggest producer is China, and it's followed by EU, Japan, US, and India. And on cement, China is, again, the world's largest producer, accounting for around 55% of the global production, and which is followed by India, which is only 8% of the global production. So China really will, I think, will be decreasing its demand as its growth for infrastructure. At the pace at which its infrastructure is kind of growing will kind of get more moderate. But I think Southeast Asia and India really need to step up and support, start planning for their policies as they look at decarbonization efforts in this sector, because that's where the biggest markets are going to be. And any associated, anything that they've done around PAT schemes or other things, initiatives, is just going to get nullified by the associated increase in demand. So they really need to step up in this respect, and so do some of the countries in Eurasia. Ultimately, what I think we need from governments and private sector, especially governments and policymakers, I think we need three things. We need them to lead by example and ambition. We need them to be, make their national policies front and center. The second thing we need is long-term policy certainty, which means we need signals that really help solidify the market's interest and direction. And that's really important. And ultimately, we need governments to talk about the real economy and sectors, and it needs to be front and center in international negotiations and platforms. So if those three things are done, I think it really helps. How can these be done? When you look at long-term policy certainty, you're looking at performance standards rather than just, specifying specific ranges. You're looking at better policies and incentives. You're looking at public finance as a means to de-risk some of the investments, and of course, innovation and support in RD&D. And from the private sector, I'd say we definitely need a lot of help on the demand side with simulating demand through advanced market commitments and buyers club. We talked about this. On the supply side, we really need the industry to step up to the challenge and participate in this net zero dialogue by 2050. And the innovation primarily needs to come from the private sector. And on the finance side, I think we all agree, finance is the lifeblood of the economy, and private finance sector players really need to help their clients transition and support this transition. So with that, I will end my remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Radhika. That's very helpful. Everyone's and Anthony, you continued to help us in the chat, which is great, with the various WEF coordination groups. Most recently, you wrote about Platform for Accelerating the Circular Economy, which sounds great. Sanjeev, I don't have you on my list, but you've joined us, so I'd be happy to hear some comments if you would like to make them.
Sure, Morgan. I'm sorry, I was told to join this group. In fact, I was invited for this series a long time ago, but I gave my approval much later. But would be happy to make a few comments because I think most of what needed to be said, I think Rebecca started off with almost everything. And I didn't really think much could be added, but when Ivan and Anthony and Sarita and then Radhika spoke, I really thought there is plenty, that could still be added on. So I would rather say ditto to the questions, to the answers that have been given. But from my point of view, let me just introduce myself first. I am from the industry. I come from Tata Steel India. I'm their Vice President, Safety, Health and Sustainability, and a metallurgical engineer by training. So the subject is very close to my heart as far as steel is concerned. So, I'll not repeat what has been said, just make 2 or 3 points, and maybe a discussion will help me enhance my understanding on the subjects. For steel, deep decarbonization, the 2 technologies that will be needed are surely CCU or S and hydrogen. Both do not seem to be in the horizon in the immediate near future. CCU and S today is ballpark $80 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. In India, steel produces around 2.5 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of crude steel. For a commodity that is traded at a ballpark of $500 per ton, this 2.5 tons of CO2, if goes through CCU and S, is around $200. How do you pass through this cost to the customer? The steel industry does not have the kind of margins to accommodate these kinds of costs. So plenty needs to happen in terms of technology to get this carbon capture and use to happen. This CO2, 2.5 tons of CO2 emission happens through the blast furnace route, which is where we use the virgin iron ore, and we have to use carbon as the reducing agent as of now. We did hear about hydrogen coming in as a reducing agent, which is the second subject here. We do not see hydrogen becoming viable in the near future again. The technology readiness levels of both these technologies are pretty low as of now. Hydrogen, we feel, will come into play more in the next decade, which is the decade of the 30s, middle part of the 30s, not even the early part of the 30s. So both these technologies are as of now not giving us much hope. So I am trying to temper the discussion a little bit, Rebecca, because I know your last slide does say that it is possible. I am trying to just make a counterpoint here. Whilst it might be possible, it is going to take a bit of time. The third possibility is the circular economy on steel. The Chinese steel industry, which produces around 55% of steel today, most of it through the primary steel making route, which is the blast furnace, this has a clearer pathway than somebody like India to decarbonize, both in terms of the recircularity, moving from the primary to the secondary, because a lot of scrap would come into play for recirculation in the Chinese economy going forward, the next few decades. So their pathways for net neutrality till 2060, they see light at the end of the tunnel, and recirculate, the secondary steel making processes is going to be a big lever for them. Surely hydrogen as well, because of the cost of electrolyzers coming down quickest in China, and therefore the cost of green hydrogen. Power is not an issue, because scientists do believe that the battle to decarbonize power has already been won, and it is just a matter of rollout there. So I'm saying green hydrogen might be possible earliest in China, and they have the pathway clearer than somebody like India, who will need more and more of steel. As I think Ivan said, that India is going to be the fastest growing steel country, then followed by probably the continent of Africa. So we'll be growing by 4 times by 2050. And what is the route that we will be growing through? I dare say that India will continue to grow and will have a fair percentage of the primary and the blast furnace route of steel making going forward, maybe even till 2050. So how do you obtain net neutrality there without having viable carbon capture and use or carbon capture and storage technologies going? So I put this question to the very learned panel here, and look for answers. How will that happen, especially when there is a lot of technology transfers that will need to happen? There will be a lot of funding transfers that will need to happen. I do not see those mechanisms in the world as of now, in spite of the the 26th edition of COP that is happening, and the various other global collaborations that are happening. So this is my point number 1. I had 2 more points to make. One more point, let us say, which is again related to global collaboration. Steel, not so much cement, is a globally traded product. It's a globally traded commodity. And we need a level playing field for such a product to be transitioning boundaries. How do we know what is the embedded carbon in the steel that is being traded? We will need mechanisms for that, and probably responsible steel and some such standards will need to come into play, which will need to be enforced across the world. A carbon pricing mechanism will need to be enforced across the world. These pricing mechanisms, these standardization enforcements will need structures which are globally acceptable. Where are these being discussed? So these are 2 or 3 questions that I would very much like to hear from some of the panelists here. I don't have all the answers like many of you, but I have a few questions which are actually bothering us in industry. Thank you.
Perfect, Sanjeev. Thanks so much for joining us. That's a very useful add, I think, to a conversation that has been going on for many decades, and where we see the same kind of proposals coming out again and again from the international community. So that's very helpful. We have about 5 or 7 minutes, something like this, before we return to the group. And so would anyone like to come in and either respond to one of your colleagues there or add to some of the things that was said? Yeah, that Anthony, and you could just put up your hands like Anthony just did. I've unmuted everybody. Okay, Anthony, and then Rebecca, please.
Right, I managed to master putting your hand on Zoom and Teams, not on every. At least this time I didn't leave myself mute. It's great. I mean, some really rich conversation here, and I mean, and thank you so much to Rebecca. I set this theme at the beginning. I think plenary really helpful. Pick up on a couple of points. First, just adding maybe a bit of nuance to what Patrick said with industry. You know, as part of the mission possible platform theory of change, you know, of course, is getting the most ambitious critical mass. We think that's really, really important. If you try and do this across the entire denominator, if you can get 20, 25 companies really want to move faster and really lead the charge and be at the vanguard of the transition because they see this as their future. Even actually some of the oil and gas that are coming to us saying we want to work with industry because we want to help create the market being fueled so we can transition out of oil and gas into so that we have a future. I think that's important. Yeah, and that mass about you don't have to win everywhere at once. You don't have to win everywhere at once geographically. You don't have to win everywhere at once with the entire sector. But it's massive and give those governments confidence to enact policy because they know they have something to act on and they know they have a business support to be more ambitious in climate policy. I think that's really important. I think the other thing, and I was just listening to Sanjeev Paul's comments, I thought I just put on and absolutely, you know, we're going to need all of these technologies. But the good news, I think, is just we have to do that overnight. We have, you know, again, in terms of what we have to do, it's a very short window indeed, but it is still 30 years. And we can still, you know, once the technology now by scaling and implementing cheaper technologies and cheaper. And if you look at the report we did with BCG, they laid this out nice, but under 10 euros a ton. Let's get on because that, you know, should be a win-win and we'll probably spend the money. The next 40% you can do from 10 to 100. So scaling those technologies ready for 2030. And the more expensive technologies we clearly are going to need. Many of the new scaling those up, we're bringing those costs down. But also, Mark Carney made the really important point during his agenda. So you're going to do that. The market's that in, and by the time you get there, the market makes big, massive financial work. It's fine. And he gave the example.
Anthony, sorry to disturb you. We cannot hear you very well. Can you probably switch off your video so bandwidth increases a bit more? Sorry.
Maybe if everyone else also sort of mutes themselves, I was able to hear him before.
Yeah, there was a bit of background noise coming out through background window or something. I don't know where you heard me from, but I was talking about the sequencing and the fact that the first 40% we do at a relatively low cost and actually save money, certainly at less than 10 euros a ton. The second tranche, 40%, we can do it from 10 to 100. And the third, is the expensive piece. We've got 20 years to scale those up and get ready and start preparing for that. And the market, they know that is coming. Mark Carney made the point. They will factor that in now. They will start investing that in gradually. So by the time you get it actually won't be such a major financial hit. You have it as a person to build your roadmap. Government, procurement, they can send an important message through procurement signals that that is the direction that we are going.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm going to turn to Rebecca. You have the last couple minutes.
Well, this hardly seems fair that I get both the beginning and the end, but I will. I'll try to be concise and to the point. So the first thing I wanted to say was I wanted to thank Mr. Paul for his extremely useful intervention. And I think that having a perspective from the industry, and particularly from one of these industries in an emerging economy, is extremely helpful in understanding the nature of the challenge. And he is entirely correct that under current market conditions, there's just no way to see why or even how it would be possible for a company like Tata Steel to be investing in, really deep decarbonization process technologies. Completely understand that. And so I think there's two things that we need to, and that's why in my initial presentation, my primary first emphasis was on changing market conditions. And that, as Anthony said, you don't need to do everything at once right now. We need to start with niche markets, with small markets where people are willing to pay premium prices for, or offer other things of financial value for decarbonized commodities, and then grow those over time. But we also need to be realistic that because of the long lead times in these industries and the high capital intensities and the need for technology innovation, it's not going to be good enough to just start with doing the cheap stuff now and then leave the expensive stuff until later. We have to start doing the expensive stuff now too, so that when we get to the place 10, 15, 20 years down the line where there really are mass markets for decarbonized commodities, then we have the technology and the capital in place to serve those markets. And so that's why we need this combination of both intensive focus on changing market conditions and also support from public sector actors, from critical purchasers, from all of the stakeholders in the system to make big investments in innovation now.
Terrific. Thanks, Rebecca. That's very helpful. So I'm sorry, I'm so many hours behind you. But I think it's time to close this panel. It's 3:19 by my simple calculation there. I'm not sure I got that right. So let me say that I really appreciate all of the panelists for joining us and for engaging and for thoughtful discussion. We've gotten to quite a bit of useful context, as well as policies and regulations and ambition and most of the big words that are used to discuss these issues. Of course, these issues are not new, and the instruments being proposed are generally not new. Even the technologies are not new, but we're still having these conversations. But maybe now we're at a position where the speed that we've been talking about for many years might start to actually accelerate. So that's an exciting time frame to be in, and hopefully with all of your good work at the company level, at the coalition level, at the international financial institution level. So thank you so much. And
to everybody else, these are the results from our poll. So as we can see, carbon pricing, public procurement were the most popular ones. And I think these resonate really well with the different discussions that we had in the breakout rooms. So on this note, I will let Rana, Gökçe, Morgan, and Jennifer. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Ana Lucia, and welcome here. Gökçe, Morgan, and Jennifer, thank you so much for moderating really lively discussions with our experts. And perhaps I'll start with the global perspectives. And Gökçe, if you want to give us a flair of the discussions you've been having, what are the main takeaways that you get from the discussion?
Thank you, Rana. It was really lively. We started with talking about different industry mitigation options. So we did touch upon different technologies, energy efficiency, material efficiency, CCS. And then we also discussed about the future location of, so for this technology question, we discussed the future location of hard-to-abate sectors. Perhaps that is different than what we have today, depending on availability of renewables and feasibility of storage and energy storage and CO2 storage. We did also touch upon the instruments for creating an enabling environment. We even made a kind of a wish list for COP26. Green public procurement was on top, as well as the poll suggested. Also a global carbon price was on the wish list. We talked about the politics of the industry transition, and within that we also covered the need to address the needs of developing countries in terms of reducing the capital cost for finance and technology transfer.
Super, great. Thank you so much for that, Gökçe. I'm quite sure that some of the COP26 team that is listening is quite happy to hear of this wish list, and we hope we'll work together with them on making this happen. I'll move over to Jennifer. I had a chance to listen as well a bit to the discussions on the country perspectives. Jennifer, if you want to share with us some of the takeaways as well coming out of the discussion.
Well, we are very eager to begin to build some of the mechanisms that link together the opportunities that were presented by Rebecca Dell. A number of important elements that country level actions could support around definitions, around certifications, and approaches to managing the specific content of our steel and cement and other materials. The need for coordination and action on those standards and certifications was flagged. In addition, we talked a little bit about the importance for thinking about specific technologies and the approaches for looking at hydrogen, for example, in the eligibility criteria for where and how we invest in projects. So two things came up as an ideas. One was a database of projects that could be investable, and the need and opportunity for thinking about this as a way to help bring investment in addition to thinking about where and how we could connect the materials information, embodied carbon, the need for us to think through those life cycle impacts and opportunities. And finally, I wanted to use the quote that we of the session. As we concluded, one of our panelists said, "Give people markets to satisfy." So that's a very important element of what we talked about, the need for national voices. And then finally, I wanted to just note that it is very clear that the social and economic shift that we're talking about also requires a level of engagement, whether that's via the existing international processes or in thinking about opportunities for job training, for thinking through where and how the economy shifts, we didn't get to spend nearly enough time focused on the social aspects and the employment opportunities in new technologies and making that accessible. But it was a very rapid fire conversation and a lot of good ideas.
Sounds like it. Absolutely. Thanks, Jennifer, for sharing that. And I'll move over to Morgan. Morgan, you had the privilege of having the only private sector representatives, I think. So it's important to give a voice as well to the private sector reps in our group. So what did your group as well discuss, and what are the main takeaways?
Thanks, Rana, and thanks for having me today. Yeah, it was a fascinating discussion. It's of course, as we discussed, we understood that this kind of discussion has been going on for some time, and that the instruments and the technologies and the goals for decarbonization in the industry sector is not a new topic, but maybe that there is some new enthusiasm and momentum in the sector, and that could help unstick some of the areas that are difficult. It's an area that has a lot of inertia to it, and it's difficult to change quickly. I think we got some good pushback from the actual company level to say that, you know, while we have some of these technologies in place and they're roughly agreed that, you know, there'll be a role for hydrogen, there'll be a role for CCS, there'll be a role for circular economy, there'll be a role for energy efficiency, as people have talked about for a long time now, that the roles and the pace of change is very different between different economies, from emerging economies, developing economies, and advanced economies, and we need to recognize that and move at likely different paces in those places. That there have been new coalitions formed. The Mission Possible partnership was mentioned by several of the panelists, thinking around systems change and how high ambition coalitions of companies, governments, and financiers can come together, build commitments, build roadmaps, implement key commitments, and agreed milestones. That should create some new momentum for the sector. We'll see how those things move, but it's positive that those new types of partnerships are coming, and that there's a focus on these hard to commit sectors. Of course, some of the most important things in moving any of this discussion is going to be prioritization and windows of opportunities, and hopefully that's coming in the industry sector. We heard, like the other groups, about the different instruments that could be used, from demand push to supply push. I think one of the important things we discussed was the focus on supply chains, from upstream to downstream, and in between, and how the different parts of the supply chain can support each other. At the same time, still a need for more rigorous standards, reporting methodologies, and data across those supply chains to support the development of markets. We heard the importance of China as a supplier for some of these industrial products, and also for the growth centers of places like India and the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, I think a lot of excitement, a lot of movement in coalitions and technology roadmaps, but still warnings that these things may not happen in all markets at the pace that some people would like to see them. That's certainly evidenced by history, and that we need to more closely link high-level aspirations and goals with detailed pathways and policies. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Morgan, for those insights. And I think I can see the convergence as well in the discussion between the different groups. So obviously there's need for more ambition, there's need for more streamlined processes and kind of harmonized benchmarks to compare and base the market demand for, need for push and pull mechanisms. But I'm quite confident with a lot of the group that we have here, and with continued cooperation with Lead It, Mission Possible, the COP26 team, the Clean Energy Ministerial and others, that we will be able to continue to drive this agenda until COP26. So keep attuned to the discussion we have here, and if you're interested to collaborate with us more on defining this pathway and bringing together the how we're going to work on this industrial decarbonization of heavy industry, just reach out to us, and we'll be happy to keep you in the loop. Thank you so much again to all of our speakers, especially as well to our moderators, and wishing you all a great day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much. And I think, so as they say, so if you would like to use the space for networking, I'll just say you can as well do that. But thank you so much and have a great day.